Chapter 395. Yi Zaiwen's strength had been ranked among the strengths of the heavens pride-level experts. However, Semi-Sage Realm was just the starting point for these heavens pride-level experts, nothing more. Afterwards, there was Sage Realm and Great Sage Realm. Therefore, this was just a beginning. It was difficult to determine the true victor in a battle among heavens pride-level experts, unless it was a battle of life or death. However, Yi Shiwen had displayed terrifying strength just now. He had suppressed a semi-sage expert by merely raising his hand. This terrifying strength had made everyone speechless. Yi Shiwen had once again stunned everyone. Perhaps, the upcoming battle would genuinely turn out to be a fierce battle between two evenly matched opponents. 3 days. Yi Shiwen had given just 3 days of time. He would leave if the Titan guy didn't show up within 3 days. This statement had once again left everyone in shock. That Titan guy had been trying to rally as much support of the people as he could in order to kill Yi Shiwen by claiming that Yi Shiwen was an evenly matched opponent. In contrast, Yi Shiwen hadn't even spared him a glance. He had merely said that he'd wait for 3 days, at most. Then he'd leave. And he would leave for the chaotic heavenly region. He was clearly looking down on the Titan body. This had left several people in uproar. People didn't find it strange that Yi Shiwen was planning to go to the chaotic heavenly region. After all, he wasn't the only heaven's pride level expert who wished to go to the chaotic heavenly region. In fact, it was said that the Titan guy also wanted to go to the chaotic heavenly world. However, he couldn't go because he had to stay here and wait for Yi Zaiwen's arrival. However, Yi Shiwen didn't care about his fight with the Titan guy. He was very busy. And if his opponent wasn't going to come out soon, then he might as well get the hell out of his way. Most people had initially thought that the Titan guy was very arrogant. They figured that he'd kill Yi Shiwen irrespective of whether he'd accept the challenge or not. He was extremely overbearing. However, Yi Shiwen turned out to be far more insolent. He didn't care about who was challenging him. If they wanted to confront him, then they must come sooner. Otherwise, they should get the hell away from him. Everyone waited for the Titan guy's reaction. Meanwhile, they slowly came to know about the conflict between him and Yi Shiwen. They found out that the Titan body guy was the second god of the army of God. It used to be a huge group, and had ruled the ancient road. However, it was brought to its knees when 3 of the gods were killed by Yi Shiwen. This led to the collapse of the army of God, and they hadn't been able to restore their prestige ever since. In addition, the first god had disappeared mysteriously. So all the responsibilities had fallen onto the shoulders of the only remaining second god. It was difficult for the second god to support the army of God by himself. Hence, the reputation of this outstanding organization had declined within no time. They had gone low-key for a certain period of time. The grudge between Yi Shiwen and the second god was as high as the sky and as deep as the ocean. It was no wonder that the second god had started to look for Yi Shiwen after he had stepped into the semi-sage realm. Anyone would have gone crazy with anger by now if they were in his place. Yi Shiwen also came to know a lot from the rumors. He realized that the Titan guy was actually the second god. No wonder there had been no news about the army of God in these 2 years. Yi Shiwen had already killed the 3rd, 4th, and the 5th god. The first god had disappeared mysteriously. Such a massive army of God had become entirely dependent on the second god, because of Yi Shiwen. Not just that, Yi Shiwen had nearly smashed and torn the army of God to pieces. This had scattered their forces. This had left the second god in deep trouble, since he had to consolidate the forces. Therefore, he hadn't gotten a chance to come looking for Yi Shiwen back then. As a matter of fact, he had recently stepped into the semi-sage realm, and had finally managed to sort out the internal matters of the army of God. So he could freely deal with Yi Shiwen now. Yi Shiwen was also determined to settle this matter of the second god. There was no trace of the first god out of the 5 gods of the army of God. And the 3rd, 4th, and the 5th god had already died in his hands. So he would only have to be careful of the first god who was still missing after he had killed the second god. In fact, he could seize the opportunity to crush the entire army of God once he had killed the second god. After that, Yi Shiwen wouldn't have to be worried about anything even if the remaining first god were to appear later on. This was a rare opportunity. The opposite party was looking to seize this opportunity to kill him. Why shouldn't he do the same? Root out the source of trouble to avoid recurring future troubles. 3 days passed in an instant. Countless lofty mountains of the true Martial University pierced through the sky. The loud roars of beasts could be heard echoing from the mountain forests. It appeared like a wonderland in the human world. Hidden Star Peak was bustling with countless disciples. They had gathered to spectate. There were experts of Legendary Realm, Truth Realm, Semi-Sage Realm, and Sage Realm as well. In fact, several experts of the Great Sage Realm had been alerted about this. They had also arrived to watch. Yi Shiwen waited on the Hidden Star Peak in silence. He was waiting for the second god to arrive. Suddenly, a loud shout rang through the vast sky. It pierced through the clouds in the sky. The space rippled like the water's surface. A light green figure ripped open the sky and rushed towards the Hidden Star Peak. He had a robust physique. He was 10 feet tall and looked extremely powerful. His facial features were as sharp as a knife. He had bright and piercing eyes. His eyebrows slanted to his temples. He looked extremely valiant. The space distorted and collapsed wherever that figure went. His incomparably dreadful form then swept out from the spatial cracks. The Titan guy has arrived. Some people with sharp eyes had recognized this figure. His overwhelming and strong aura had shaken the heaven and earth. It's indeed the Titan guy. Just look at his body. No wonder they call him Titan Body. He's got such a majestic stature. An ordinary person's physique wouldn't even come close. He possesses the bloodline of the Titan race. It was true. The Titans themselves were ancient gods. That's why his subordinates are known as the Army of God. Such terrifying imposing aura can suppress a truth-level expert to death. He has an invincible body, one derived from an immemorial race. I'm not very optimistic about Yi Shiwen. I still think that Yi Shiwen has hope. I guess you haven't seen him fight before. He unleashes an overwhelming golden ocean. He appears like a golden god when he casts out that golden ocean move. It almost appears as if he's God who has descended to rule the world. His body isn't inferior to that of the Titan body. I've yet to hear of an expert who could challenge Yi Shiwen's physique. This will absolutely turn out to be a fierce battle between two evenly matched giants. Yi Shiwen, come out to die. The voice of the second god exploded after he arrived in front of the Hidden Star Peak. The sonic booms exploded in all directions. It seemed like a Milky Way of huge sound waves had swept across. It had caused the massive trees in the surrounding area to collapse. Humph! You're an arrogant young man. Come, I'll teach you the profoundness of this world. A cold sound transmitted from the Hidden Star Peak. It was followed by a startling sword energy. The sword energy rushed towards the sky in a flash. It streaked across the vast sky and shattered the space. Even the chaos started to leak out from cracked space. This is a matter of the younger generation. We mustn't interfere. A discontented sound echoed from the depths of the void. A massive hand swept down from the sky and grabbed that startling sword energy. Bang! It seemed as if the entire world had collapsed and broken into small pieces. An incomparably horrifying light burst out in a flash. The yin and yang elements of chaos leaked out and spread around. The terrifying aura swept out in the surroundings. Wei Guangyuan, you old fart, you dare to go along with his unreasonable and reckless actions. An angry voice sounded from the Hidden Star Peak. Bai Jiansong came flying from that direction. His eyes were open wide. He seemed to be glaring angrily. Bai Jiansong had come out of his closed-door training because of Yi Shiwen's matter. He had recently stepped into the Great Sage Realm, so he didn't have too much control on his own power. His Great Sage aura was leaking out, and it was forming a terrifying cyclone around him. He didn't very different from a devil god. However, the place in the depths of the void was still tranquil. Nothing happened from that direction. What? Clear Sky Peak's Wei Guangyuan is personally supporting the Titan guy. No wonder he has dared to openly challenge Yi Shiwen to a death fight. An expert uttered in surprise. Wei Guangyuan held a very high position in the Clear Sky Peak. He was the chief of the elders. He had personally shown up for this event. That clearly showed that the Clear Sky Peak was supporting the second god in his mission to kill Yi Shiwen. Nobody would have bothered if this matter concerned ordinary disciples. After all, The true martial university had a massive pool of disciples. A large number of these disciples died every day. Sometimes, they died in the hands of the experts of other forces, or got killed by demon beasts and so on. Casualties to such disciples weren't unusual. However, Yi Shiwen and the Titan Guy were ranked among the Heaven's Pride level experts of this generation. Only a few people could be considered as treasures in a particular generation. They were extremely precious. Only these people could become the pillars of the true martial university in the future. The death of any such expert would set off a huge unrest. Moreover, both the experts were looking to kill each other. This matter was bound to attract the attentions of countless people. In fact, it could even lead to an overall conflict between their inheritances. Every Heavens level disciple was like a future pillar for any inheritance. Death of any such expert could injure their strength very greatly. The Hidden Star Peak had very few people. However, that didn't mean that one could crush them that easily. Clear Sky Peak was ranked among the top 10 inheritances. Their strength was profound, simply incredible. There was a possibility of a full-scale conflict between the two inheritances. There would have been no issues if this was a conflict between two individuals alone. However, Wei Guangyuan had arrived here. This revealed the intention of the Clear Sky Peak very clearly. They stood strong in the second god's support. They were clearly biased, and in favor of the second god. Bai Jiansong had immediately understood the Clear Sky Peak's intentions. That had made him furious. The Titan Guy himself was extremely overbearing. And now the Clear Sky Peak also stood in his support. He couldn't help being furious at this. Chapter 396. The confrontation between these two individuals had transformed into a confrontation between two forces. Moreover, these two forces belong to the ranks of the top 100 inheritances. And the confrontation between these two inheritances would be a startling event. Bai Jiansong's eyes were ice cold. His recently attained fearful strength of the Great Sage Realm was boiling. His real elemental energy was extremely terrifying. He could shoot down the stars and grab the moonlight by merely lifting his hand. Several people exclaimed in admiration. Bai Jiansong used to be at half-step Great Sage Realm. But he had finally stepped into the Great Sage Realm after 2 years of closed-door training. He was an outstanding talent of his generation. So many people knew about him. However, he had been stuck at the half-step Great Sage Realm for decades. But now he had finally crossed this step, and had opened boundless future prospects for himself by becoming a high-level expert of the true martial university. Bai Jiansong had sword cultivation. He was a sword expert with tyrannical strength. In fact, he was far more tyrannical than the martial experts of his realm. Humph! Bai Jiansong sneered and brandished his sword. This caused an explosion. The startling sword energy streaked across the vast sky for dozens of miles. It rushed towards the second god to rip him apart. Bai Jiansong, you're too presumptuous. The expert who had been waiting at a distant place couldn't help but roar out at this time. Then his figure finally appeared. The sword attack carried such a terrifying power that it couldn't be stopped from afar. So this expert had to appear in person to stop it. A slightly thin figure appeared in the sky. His real elemental energy surged up in the void and began to boil. A big hand grabbed the sword energy and stopped it from hitting the second god. Bai Jiansong, you're repeatedly attacking a disciple of our Clear Sky Peak. Are you planning to start a war between the two peaks? Wei Guangyuan shouted. He had grabbed that sword energy. However, his white hair was still fluttering under the impact of the formidable energy. Bai Jiansong sneered and spoke. This disciple of your Clear Sky Peak is going too far. You're the one who agreed to this bullshit mortal combat. You're such a moron. If this will lead to war, then it's better to start the war. Our Hidden Star Peak has very few people. But it's not easy to bully us. Bai Jiansong and Wei Guangyuan clashed as he finished speaking. They forced their way up into the blue sky while they remained engaged in a fight with each other. They tore open the void and went inside. Their battle was extremely terrifying. After all, two great sage experts were engaged in a hand-to-hand combat. It could destroy the nearby peaks. The sky was shattered and broken into small pieces. Endless amount of chaos rolled down from the debris. Several Sage Realm experts abandoned the second god's side and rushed into the void to keep up with Bai Jiansong and Wei Guangyuan. Even the Sage Realm experts rarely got to witness a fight between two great sage experts. Wei Guangyuan was a peak-level expert of the Great Sage Realm. He had been famous for over 1,000 years. Bai Jiansong was a matured person as well. He too had lived for hundreds of years. These two experts didn't belong to the same generation, but their power could easily overwhelm their opponent. They possessed outstanding power and prestige in their respective generations. Not to mention that the pure sword cultivation of these two was incredible and contained formidable attack power. It was indeed a wonderful duel that wasn't just exceptional, but rarely seen. The clash between two junior disciples of the same sect had given rise to this heaven-shaking battle. Humph! Yi Shiwen, come out to die. Nobody will disturb us now. Let's fight. The second god sneered. His bronze-colored face exposed a somewhat evil grin. A sonic boom dissipated in all directions and left the entire hidden star peak to tremble violently. Many experts in the surroundings were excited by this. Finally, this day had arrived. They had waited for 3 days. This was the first collision between two Heaven's Pride-level experts of the younger generation. The expedition to rule this generation was going to begin from this point. The second god's cold fighting power spread in the void. His tall figure began to exude cyan-colored energy, which started to surge up. He appeared like the reincarnation of an ancient titan. The cyan-colored real elemental energy wrapped around his body like armor. He held a half-broken lance in his hand. It could be seen that this half-broken lance must have been patched up by an outstanding expert. However, it didn't look like the original one. He had inherited this ancient lance from his ancestors. It was said that this lance had been used as a weapon by a real titan once upon a time. The second god had inherited it from the ancestors of the army of God countless years ago. The lance he had inherited was broken. Later, he had asked the best godsmith to craft the rear part of the lance and patch it. It was still far short of its original power. However, it was still very difficult to endure. The space unceasingly collapsed and restored wherever that lance went. This continuous destruction and construction of the space left everyone to tremble with fear. The second god was without any protection besides that. His body itself was his best defense. Many people looked at the tyrannical figure of the second god from behind and started to whisper amongst themselves. The second god was extremely tyrannical. It was evident from his aura that an ordinary expert of the semi-sage realm wouldn't be able to block his lance, and would be stabbed to death by the lance in one shot. In fact, no one knew how strong he really was. Nobody knew whether the other expert could resist this lance or not. After all, none of the other Heaven's Pride-level experts had fought with him yet. So, people could also only speculate the extent of his strength. And now, they could obtain clues from this battle between him and Yi Shiwen. He enjoyed an outstanding reputation. However, Yi Ziwen's reputation was even more incredible. He had killed the disciples of the Law Enforcement Hall on his very first day after he had entered the true martial university. Millions of disciples had arrived in this session, but only Yi Shiwen could dare to deal with such a matter. The second god's killing intention turned ice cold. The pain of losing his brothers had made him extremely ferocious. Even his killing intention had turned exceptionally strong. Nobody dared to approach him since his intense killing intention would tear them apart. In fact, his killing intention wouldn't just kill the body, it might even kill the soul. Several experts of the younger generation felt greatly disappointed with themselves, since they had been secretly comparing themselves with the second god. They had thought that these Heaven's Pride-level experts were just extraordinary, nothing more. And it was just their own bad luck that they couldn't become one. However, they had come to realize that they would have never been chosen as Heaven's Pride-level expert even if they had a better luck. They had now witnessed the incomparable tyranny of the second god, and they had realized that it was impossible to reach that level. The Heaven's Pride-level experts couldn't be taken lightly. Yi Shiwen had also passed through many intense battles like any other Heaven's Pride-level expert, and he had won them all in order to be ranked as a Heaven's Pride-level expert. So people had no choice but to acknowledge him. Bang! The golden divinities condensed into a pillar of energy and pierced through the void. It cut across the sky and surged up violently. It scattered in all directions like a golden ocean. It seemed as if a golden country had been formed, the very country of gods. A figure appeared in front of everyone. It was surfing on the golden waves. He had bright and piercing eyes, and the golden energy was surging around him. It was none other than Yi Shiwen. The second god had moved at a surprisingly fast speed. But Yi Zaiwen's speed wasn't too slow in comparison. He rushed forward and arrived in front of the second god. Yi Shiwen, I didn't think that you'd dare to appear before me. The second god's eyes turned bloodshot as soon as he saw Yi Shiwen. He shouted as he continued to stare at Yi Shiwen. Come to die. I must take the revenge for the third, fourth, and the fifth brother. The second god spoke in a low voice. It seemed as if the faces and voices of the deceased third, fourth, and fifth god had appeared before his eyes. It aroused even more hatred for Yi Shiwen in his heart. You're the same as those idiots. You're as eager to throw away your life. Yi Shiwen replied. His eyes looked straight at the second god. They seemed motionlessly glued to him. The second god became even more furious after he heard this. He couldn't tolerate to hear Yi Shiwen talk bad about his dead brothers. This was a huge insult to their name. It was simply unforgivable. The silence suddenly perished as the second god moved into action. Two greenish-black lights were emitted from his ice-cold pupil and rushed straight into the sky. His vision was firmly locked on Yi Shiwen. He certainly didn't wish to allow Yi Shiwen to escape at any cost. Then he trod forward. The surrounding space bounced, and it was reduced to fragments. The second god swept out a cyan-colored sea of energy. It blotted out the sky and covered the earth as it swept towards Yi Shiwen to engulf him. The world itself lost its color in the wake of such a terrifying attack. Most onlookers immediately retreated. They didn't dare to come close. They were afraid that the force of the aftermath would kill them. Yi Shiwen refused to admit being the weaker one. So he immediately rushed forward. An endless sea of golden divinities was unleashed in the forms of giant waves, and swept out towards the second god. Boom! The cyan sea of energy and the golden sea of divinities knocked against each other in the void. It appeared as if two gigantic oceans had collided in the sky. The surging waves of dreadful power were unleashed unto the surroundings after the collision. The two experts stepped upon those waves of energy, and arrived in front of each other. They could almost see each other's facial expressions. Die! The second god roared. The entire space collapsed around his body, and broke into small pieces. He discharged all his power, and it reached the pinnacle. He looked like the reincarnation of an ancient titan. His tyranny had reached the pinnacle. It was as if he was the ruler of this country, as if the entire world belonged to him. His lance swept down from the sky at a lightning speed like a long black snake. It shattered the space on the way as it arrived in front of Yi Shiwen. However, Yi Zaiwen's extremely terrifying sword intention soared into the sky, and formed an incomparably huge sword intention. He gave a loud shout, and the golden divinities throughout his body began to surge. Then the sword intention fell downwards. Bang! The lance and the sword intention ferociously collided in the void. A big section of the sky collapsed, and turned into fine powder. The pitch-dark surface of the universe was revealed in the aftermath of this collision. The chaotic energy had started to boil on the other side. In fact, some of it leaked out and split open the nearby space. The first collision between them had turned out to be very stunning. The two of them retreated several steps. Both individuals seemed somewhat amazed by each other's power. Yi Shiwen and the second god were in good condition. Their bodies were their biggest defense. They had never come across any expert with a physique that could rival theirs. Yet they didn't feel surprised, nor were sympathetic for each other. On the contrary, a fiercer killing intention as well as fighting intention scattered in all directions. Chapter 397. There was no scope of sympathy here. Rather, it was inappropriate in this situation since these two opponents only had the desire to kill. Your gilded body is worthless. I'll kill you like a dog. The second god squinted as he spoke coldly. His eyes shone and emitted a sharp beam. This beam almost condensed into a solid beam of light. It could frighten a person's soul. It's ridiculous to compare your gilded body with my Titan body. The speed of the lance didn't decrease. It transformed into a black snake and set off an incomparably powerful and terrifying aura. It pierced the void, and the sky got shattered into pieces as it rushed towards Yi Shiwen. Clang! Yi Zaiwen's sword intention condensed into a long sword in his hand. Buried earth sword. The sharp sword beam sent out an incomparably frightening force. A long dragon was unleashed, and it moved forward to face the incoming attack. Bang! Horrifying waves of energy were swept out from both sides. The energy waves swept across crazily in the surroundings and made cracks in the void. The two experts clashed in midair. They were trying their best to not affect the true martial university as much as possible. Otherwise, the one to survive the battle would have to face the criticism of the high-level experts. Your Titan body is also worthless. The so-called Titan god race has nothing more than an undeserved reputation. Yi Shiwen replied coldly. You started to clamor about challenging me only after you broke through to the semi-sage realm. That clearly shows that your cowardice, and also your lack of confidence in your Titan body. Your Titan body is nothing but a joke. I would have crushed you like an ant if we were in same realm. Yi Shiwen had spoken this very calmly, as if this matter wasn't even related to him. The crowd heard this, and was sent in an uproar. He had dared to speak such insulting words in front of the Titan guy. No other Heaven's Pride level expert would have dared to speak such words. In fact, no one would have believed these words even if a Heaven's Pride level expert had dared to say such boasting words about being superior to the Titan body. However, some people had believed in Yi Zaiwen's words. They didn't know whether any of the other Heaven's Pride level experts had reached the semi-sage realm or not. But they knew that Yi Shiwen hadn't. In fact, Yi Shiwen hadn't even reached the half-step Legendary's great complete realm yet. To say that I could have crushed you like ant if we were in same realm, perhaps wasn't just boasting. Yi Shiwen was merely at half-step legendary 9th stage. However, he could easily suppress an ordinary expert of the semi-sage realm. He would become far more dreadful once he had advanced to the semi-sage realm. Saying that he would kill him like an ant clearly showed his confidence and boldness. This was the reason why the other Heaven's Pride level experts hadn't dared to look down on Yi Shiwen, even though he was at a lower level compared to them. In fact, some people even considered him as the strongest Heaven's Pride level expert. This was because he was still at a lower level. No one among his peers would be able to suppress him once his level would match theirs. Of course, one must also consider the fact that Yi Shiwen was making a constant progress. However, the others were also making progress, and it wouldn't be easy to surpass them. Ha 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 ha. The second god looked upwards and laughed out loud. The killing intention in his eyes had turned even more intense. He was always aware that Yi Shiwen was a threat. So he had decided to wait and gain confidence by having a breakthrough to the semi-sage realm before he set out to kill Yi Shiwen. That was because he knew that Yi Zaiwen's cultivation would be lower than his own by several levels, once he had made the breakthrough to the semi-sage realm. So it would be impossible for Yi Shiwen to catch up with him in such a short time. Perhaps Yi Shiwen could jump several levels within the legendary realm, but he wouldn't stand a chance against him once he had stepped into the semi-sage realm. How could the sage word be taken lightly? Jumping level didn't mean much at a later phase because the key point was to condense principles. Otherwise, the fighting strength would remain stuck. However, he hadn't anticipated that he had made a massive miscalculation. He was sure that his plan was foolproof, and figured that he was absolutely safe. However, he found out that he had made a blunder after the fight started. Yi Shiwen was far more powerful than he had imagined. The killing intention frantically surged up inside his heart, because Yi Shiwen always turned out to be contrary to his expectations. Therefore, he desperately wanted to strangle Yi Shiwen in the cradle this time. Several people exclaimed in amazement. The combat between these two individuals had indeed turned out to be a fierce struggle between two evenly matched giants. Neither of the two was ordinary. The second god emitted cyan-colored rays of light from his body. These rays of light began to boil. The sound of his loud shout proliferated far, far away in all directions, and shattered the heaven and earth. It was an exceptionally terrifying scene. The second god had taken the initiative and attacked. He advanced with large strides. It seemed as if his steps were shattering the void to pieces. He looked unusually brilliant as his cyan-colored figure dashed about. His massive imposing aura seemed like a huge mountain as it advanced towards Yi Shiwen to kill him. Yi Zaiwen's countenance turned serious. He had said that he could kill that Titan guy like an ant if they were in the same realm. However, he mustn't spare any effort since they weren't in same realm at present. Moreover, he didn't have much of an advantage of having a superior physique like always since the Titan guy also had an invincible body. And an outstanding one at that. One which had been famous since ancient times. He shouted loudly. The golden divinities surged up within his body. Then the divinities swept out in the sky and wrapped around Yi Zaiwen's entire body. Yi Shiwen brandished his long sword with a clang. He issued a sword beam. And it seemed as if the universe itself would collapse at any moment. The energy swept across in all directions, as if to sweep away the entire world. The sword attack took the shape of a sword dragon and rushed forward. Bang! The sound of the explosion resembled the collapse of a galaxy. The space got distorted. It then cracked open with a loud explosion. Then the chaos leaked out from the crack. This was purely a collision of bodies, and not skills. This frightened the spectators even further. Their strong bodies were the biggest assets these two individuals had in their arsenal. They were colliding ferociously, and these clashes were setting off frightening shock waves of unimaginable proportions. These shock waves could crush anything that stood in their path. They were wreaking havoc by launching such vast attacks. They hadn't even used any exquisite martial arts yet. In fact, each of their attacks was 10 times more powerful as any martial art-based attack. In other words, they could merely use their physical abilities to crush 10 martial art attacks at once. A clash with these two would be disastrous for the experts of the same realm. That was because their attacks wouldn't work on those two. An ordinary attack couldn't even sway them. So inflicting injuries to them would be simply out of the question. Yi Zaiwen's body had left many people in shock. Yi Shiwen was well known as Golden War God. However, nobody knew what kind of physique he possessed in reality. It seemed that there was no information about such a physique even among the well-known tough physiques. The Titan body had an outstanding reputation since ancient times. However, for some reason, Yi Zaiwen's body hadn't fallen into a disadvantageous position while competing with the Titan body. This had stunned countless people. Yi Shiwen faintly felt that his arms had turned somewhat numb. This was the first time he had come across such a tough opponent. He remembered that the legends that had said that the Titan god enjoyed great reputation for possessing an incredibly strong body and strength enough to lift a mountain without any problem. The second god was also amazed by Yi Shiwen. He hadn't anticipated that Yi Shiwen would be able to resist his strongest blow. This was collision of bodies, but the most important point to note was that Yi Shiwen also possessed extremely huge strength. The second god had the Titan body. His body was naturally going to be strong. But what kind of a body did Yi Shiwen have? Could it be that he possessed the bloodline of some ancient devil god? He quickly searched through the names of several ancient devil gods in his mind. However, he didn't find any similarity between any one of them and Yi Shiwen. However, he didn't have much time to think due to the criticality of this juncture. He sneered and said, "I don't know what kind of physique you possess. However, it was the biggest mistake of your life to provoke me." Yi Shiwen coldly looked at the second god. He smiled and replied, "I guess that you only find your own physique to be worthy of a mention. But your Titan body is crap in my eyes. Even if the Titan god were to stand before me, I would tear him apart with my hands." Yi Zaiwen's hair was flying in the air. His eyes were as sharp as knives. His fighting intention was boiling. He wasn't merely talking big. A practitioner could easily tear apart the gods and devils with their hands once the tyrant body technique had been practiced to the highest layer. Even the Titan god wouldn't be a big deal. Yi Shiwen was extremely confident that even the real gods and devils wouldn't stand a chance against his tyrant body, let alone someone human who possessed their blood. The people in the surroundings started to gawk at this. What was Yi Shiwen trying to say? Did he mean that the Titan body wasn't an extraordinary physique? Countless people felt their eyes popping out at this revelation. The physique of an ordinary person couldn't be compared with those special physiques as far as they were concerned. The special physiques might have some weaknesses, but they were certainly stronger when compared to the physiques of ordinary people. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been regarded as special physiques in the first place. Moreover, the Titan body was the most famous of all the well-known special physiques. Those with special physique basically had invincible bodies. So it was even more shocking if Yi Shiwen didn't possess some special physique, since that would mean that a person with an ordinary physique had been able to last this long in a fight against the second god. Nobody would believe this. Perhaps Yi Shiwen had practiced some kind of an extraordinary body tempering technique. This wasn't impossible. Not every ancient sage had possessed special physiques or some incredible bloodline. Rather, some outstanding geniuses had founded various kinds of body tempering techniques, and the practice of these techniques could enable one to challenge the gods and devils. This wasn't false. However, those power techniques had disappeared in the ancient times, and there were hardly any such invincible power techniques left now. "You're extremely arrogant and ignorant," the second god sneered. Yi Shiwen was fearless because of his ignorance in his opinion. The Titan god had an illustrious prestige. In fact, he still enjoyed the name of a fierce god. However, Yi Shiwen had dared to say such demeaning things about him. That itself showed that he was fearless. "I'll send a heretic like you on your way to hell," the second god sneered and said. Bang! The second god trod forward. The sky itself fragmented due to the impact. He released an imposing aura, as if to prove that he held the superior monotheistic. Cyan-colored energy waves blotted out the sky and covered the earth as they swept towards Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen grasped his long sword and countered the incoming attack. Yi Shiwen displayed a remarkable sword skill. It seemed as if he was a sword cultivator. "My single sword move can unleash 10,000 principles." His real elemental energy no longer fluctuated on his body alone. It rushed ahead. The long sword in his hand was made of condensed sword intention. It darted out with a swoosh. Bang! Yi Ziwen's long sword transformed into a sword dragon. It pierced through the cyan-colored energy waves in a flash. It then drilled its way into the waves and rushed inside. Chapter 398. Yi Shiwen wasn't unfamiliar with the sword cultivation power techniques. In fact, the buried sword secret was a supreme sword cultivation power technique. One's strength could level up to an incredible extent if it was comprehended to its fullest potential. The sword cultivation power techniques had always been known to possess superb attack power. However, Yi Shiwen hadn't used them. He had certainly experienced quick advancement as far as his sword cultivation was concerned, but it had been too quick. He had indeed witnessed a sharp rise in his sword cultivation, but it had been difficult to lay a solid foundation. Yi Shiwen must walk on the road of martial arts, and sword art was merely a part of martial arts. This was the reason why Yi Shiwen always followed the norm of preferring martial arts over sword arts. However, it was an undeniable fact that sword cultivation was superior in terms of attack power. Yi Shiwen unleashed the sword skills against his enemy. The long sword pierced through the cyan-colored energy waves and arrived in front of the second god. Yi Shiwen had only brandished his long sword, nothing else. Bang! The most terrifying collision took place. It was a startling clash between Yi Ziwen's long sword and second god's lance. Endless divine beams were emitted in a flash. Their weapons had collided, and this collision had produced incredible rays of light. A frightening figure emerged from the lance. It was a very tall figure. It seemed as if it was the tallest figure in the world. It was the giant phantom of an ancient titan. It was extremely horrifying. He held a long and incredible lance in his hand. It was emitting incredible divine beams. These beams pierced the vast sky and swept down towards Yi Shiwen to stab him. Yi Ziwen's eyes flashed brightly. That lance had a fragment of the ancient titan's soul inside it. It had been resurrected from the lance. Its incomparably dreadful aura firmly locked on Yi Shiwen. The murderous aura was swept out. It was as scary as its mentions in the legends. This lance had been the weapon of an ancient titan. It was certainly half broken. However, it contained the conscious soul fragment of an ancient titan. The second god had used his titan blood to stimulate the lance, and that had led to the ancient titan's resurrection. Clang! Yi Zaiwen's long sword released an incredible sword intention, and it rushed straight into the sky. The sword intention condensed and took the shape of an old man in the void. It was the figure of that strong sword expert whom Yi Shiwen had earlier seen. He held a long sword. Very tightly at that. His sleeves were fluttering about. He carried an aura so imposing that it seemed as if he was looking down on the world. His eyes seemed as sharp as a sword. The world has no choice but to follow my way. The Tao principles of the world swept out along with the incredible rays of light emitted by that sword expert. The sword expert suppressed all other Tao principles. Everyone had a scare. Apprehensive feelings had started to rise in their hearts. They felt as if they had no choice but to submit to this sword expert and follow his invincible path. This was an invincible path. Everyone had to walk alone on this path. And to do so, they couldn't walk on their ordinary cultivation route. Not to mention that they would have to start their cultivation on this path from the beginning. That ancient Titan figure had once suppressed the entire universe of gods with his power. However, no one knew that the sword expert was a great personality of the ancient era. He had never shown any signs of weakness. He would merely use his world-crushing sword to destroy his enemies' martial ways. The two extremely terrifying and ancient forces ferociously collided in the void. Their powers began to boil together. Both of them were utilizing the power of principles. The surrounding experts of the younger generation were covered in cold sweat. What kind of terrifying power was this? Both of these individuals were ranked as Heaven's Pride level experts. However, many people hadn't been convinced of that. After all, these experts themselves were geniuses from different regions. They couldn't have entered the true martial university otherwise. There were many inner disciples present among them as well. However, they didn't have any choice but to admit that those two were extremely formidable after they had witnessed their terrifying powers. Was it even possible for a semi-sage expert to discharge such power? This kind of an attack would be too exaggerated for a sage expert, even for a senior sage expert. In fact, this wasn't just pure strength. Perhaps, these two would be lacking when compared with sage expert on the basis on strength alone. However, an ordinary sage realm expert wouldn't come close to them when one would take the level of this battle into account. It could be said that these two individuals had grasped some incredible secret techniques. Both of them had come across unimaginable fortuitous encounters. The onlookers learnt this as they witnessed the wills of these two men collide so fiercely in the void. Clang! 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 The lance and the long sword collided countless times in a split second. The Titan lance contained extraordinary strength. It vigorously smashed the vast sky into pieces. That old sword expert's long sword was incomparably sharp, and he cut open the vast sky with just his long sword. Nothing else. The confrontation between these two had surpassed everyone's imagination. It was like the confrontation between two mythical characters. One of them was merely a leftover wisp of soul. It wasn't as scary as the real thing. And the other was a simulation based on Yi Zaiwen's experience. Yi Shiwen had started to question the origins of the mysterious space. That was because his mysterious space had managed to simulate the three elements, essence, energy, and soul to mold the clone of the sword expert. And this clone was almost like the real one. The strength of the simulated clone was certainly far below that of the old sword expert. However, it was still very dreadful. Everyone looked stupefied. The powers of those two weren't that terrifying. However, the spectators could easily make out the exquisiteness of the martial arts being employed during the battle. They were looking at the battle between those two giant phantoms, and felt as if they were witnessing a battle between two Tao principles. The two phantoms certainly didn't have living consciousness. However, their pure and unadulterated fighting spirit had made everyone even more dumbstruck. It took long to describe the whole thing, but everything happened in a short period of time. And these giant phantoms had already exchanged more than 1,000 blows in this short time. Almost nobody was able to see the exact number of blows that were exchanged between them. Such power had surpassed everyone's imagination. But the loss of control over the phantoms was also apparent. Yi Shiwen felt that the old sword expert had nearly gone out of his control. It was as if the old sword expert had been awakened by the insane fighting intention of that titan. It seemed as if a trace of consciousness was still left in the sword intention, and it seemed as if it had been aroused due to the collision with this fierce opponent. Bang! The two giant figures ferociously collided, and then collapsed into pieces. Countless collisions had taken place by this time, that had left the two giant phantoms covered in various kinds of cracks. And this final collision had shattered them. Yi Shiwen and the second god rushed towards each other to kill. There was no trace of hesitation in their actions. The lance and the long sword streamed across the horizon, and went towards their targets. Puff! Puff! Blood splashed, and broken bone fragments were sent swirling in the air. Both of them staggered and dropped down since they had sustained terrible injuries. The lance had opened a huge hole in Yi Ziwen's stomach. The cyan-colored energy was crazily devouring Yi Ziwen's wound, else he would have recovered instantly. The second god had also sustained a serious wound. The wound had gone down to his bones. His bones could be seen from the wound's opening. He was cut from the shoulder, and down to his stomach. It was obvious that this sword attack could have cleft him in two. However, that hadn't happened, thanks to his tough titan body. His body was just like a titan's. Even so, this injury had turned his complexion pale. After all, he had nearly been split into two. Countless surrounding disciples were in shock. They felt their hearts tremble. They hadn't anticipated that these two would end up wounding each other in this first ever head-on collision. These two individuals with incredible bodies had finally entered the stage of melee-style fighting. They wouldn't be drenched in blood if this were only a practice match for exchanging pointers. However, these two were engaged in a vicious battle. Yi Ziwen's long sword had almost cleft the second god into two, and the second god's lance had nearly stabbed Yi Ziwen's heart. They weren't holding back, not one bit. These were precisely the so-called moved of life or death. A couple of ordinary individuals wouldn't have survived if they were to exchange places with these two. One individual would have been stabbed to death, and the other individual would have been split into two halves. Both individuals would have died together. Even a minor difference of strength between two experts can decide the victor of the fight. However, these two apparently had same strength. They both stood at the peak of the initial stage of semi-sage realm. Moreover, the most important thing was that they had extremely tough bodies. Any other opponent would get killed in just one move when faced with either of these two. However, these two had merely sustained severe injuries when pit against each other. Not to mention that these injuries hadn't affected their vitality. If someone had dared to replace these two individuals, they would have died long ago. I didn't expect that the Titan guy would sustain injuries. This must be the first time he has suffered a loss. I've never heard of him getting injured before. He always relies on his invincible body to bully others. He has finally suffered a loss this time. That Yi Shiwen is abnormally strong. He doesn't seem to claim that he possessed some special physique. Don't tell me he has obtained the body tempering technique of some ancient sage? They had guessed it correctly. However, they didn't know that Yi Shiwen had only obtained the first layer of tyrant body technique. He had patched the rest by himself. He had created his own technique to suit his needs. He hadn't relied on the ancient sage alone. Yi Shiwen took the initiative and began to recover. He used his own energy to expel the cyan color foreign energy that surrounded his wound. Then he began to operate the Phoenix regeneration technique, and started to repair his wound. Afterwards, he looked coldly at the second god, and rushed towards him again. The long sword in his hand transformed into a long dragon, and swept down. The second god didn't get much time to think. He could only brandish his lance to defend himself. Bang! Yi Ziwen's long sword bombarded waves of incomparably terrifying force. They struck the second god, and sent him flying for a few meters. He was indeed sent flying for only a few meters. However, he had already fallen into a disadvantageous position. His titan body did recover quite quickly, but it couldn't possibly match the regeneration speed of Yi Ziwen's Phoenix regeneration technique. Yi Shiwen was continuously maintaining himself at his peak condition. Meanwhile, the second god's condition was getting more and more serious with every passing moment. He had been slowly suppressed and pushed into a disadvantageous position by Yi Shiwen. Chapter 399. In a fight between experts, even a small disparity between the contenders could create a huge difference. Yi Ziwen's strength was dependent on his healing ability, and it was far more formidable than that of the second god. This small disparity was enough for Yi Shiwen to slowly and gradually suppress the second god. Yi Shiwen consistently maintained himself at his peak condition. The second god also possessed an outstanding secret healing technique as well. Moreover, his Titan body itself was extremely strong. However, he couldn't possibly be placed on par with Yi Shiwen. I hadn't thought that the Titan guy would fall into the disadvantageous position. Yeah. It's very difficult to tell who's got the stronger body and who's got the weaker one. The disparity between their physiques isn't clear, but there is huge difference between their healing powers. Yi Ziwen's healing technique simply goes against the heaven's will. It's indeed incredible. The Titan guy was very aggressive in the beginning. He was the one who came to cause trouble for Yi Shiwen. He wanted to kill Yi Shiwen. But the outcome has finally turned out to be like this. Everyone discussed as the battle continued. The second god looked coldly at Yi Shiwen. Blood was dripping from his chest. Yi Ziwen's sword had repeatedly struck his body. Even his Titan body couldn't endure such attacks. He heard everyone's comments about him, but he had disregarded them. He had indeed been suppressed. However, he was far from being in danger as suspected by the others. After all, both of them had sustained similar injuries. It was just that one individual recovered quicker than the other. However, these secret healing techniques had a common characteristic. It was to hurt one's vitality in order to restore one's injuries faster, especially when the wounds were serious. After all, these techniques went against the heaven's will, so they had to come with a heavy price in exchange of accelerated recovery. Yi Shiwen, you're very strong. But, you can only become a nameless skeleton in my path to invincibility. The second god's countenance turned ice cold. The wounds on his body unexpectedly began to transform into scars. Bang! The second god's imposing aura instantly changed, very significantly. A dark green cyclone began to revolve around his body. The metal rings worn on his arms and ankles began to rotate as his stature increased by a section. The second god had never revealed his secret true Titan body, the one that had been mentioned in the legends. This was the first time he had revealed it. He had previously seen Yi Shiwen as a formidable opponent. But Yi Shiwen had turned out to be even more formidable an opponent than he had imagined. His killing intention began to burn even stronger. His path to invincibility would become clearer if he could kill this super formidable opponent. Yi Shiwen, be careful. He's transforming into a Titan. Yi Mo warned Yi Shiwen. His strength will increase by leaps and bounds after he transforms into a Titan. Yi Shiwen nodded. He was standing in the sky with the long sword in his hand. He was blankly looking at the second god. He trampled the void as he fiercely trod forward, and arrived in front of the second god. Yi Ziwen's sharp sword had cut open the vast sky. His killing intention had spread all around. The many spectating disciples of the true martial university were left in utter shock as they watched from afar. They could feel the astonishing killing intention that was coming out from his long sword. Then they looked at the second god. His strength had increased by a layer after he had completed his transformation into the real Titan body. This left them dumbstruck. These two individuals were going against the heaven's will. The second god sneered. He grasped the cold black lance and rushed out. His imposing aura had become more powerful than before. This was indeed the real Titan body. All the heavenly races had been shaken by its power at one point in time. His left hand rose in the sky. It grasped a bunch of strong winds and lightning from inside the void. And then he thrust them towards Yi Shiwen. The winds and lightning blotted out the sky as they rolled towards Yi Shiwen to crush him. These exceptionally terrifying winds and lightning could strangle a truth-level expert to death. An ordinary legendary expert would be seriously injured by their force. Gales and lightning were like pets for Titans. It seemed as if the god of gales and lightning was watching over this fight from above, as the second god continuously chanted some sutras. Bang! the gales and lightning swept down towards Yi Shiwen. The dreadful wind pressed down upon Yi Shiwen to crush him. This mixture of gales and lightning was like a grindstone that had advanced to grind Yi Shiwen to death. Yi Shiwen sneered. The thunder and lightning carried the strong positive power of the world. But he wasn't afraid of the power of lightning, nor did he feel restrained in the face of it. Could these thunders and lightning be more formidable than the energies unleashed by the heavenly tribulation? Yi Zaiwen's left hand transformed into a heavenly big hand. It stretched out, as if to grab something. Yi Shiwen grabbed those gales and lightning. Then he began to operate the tyrant body technique and absorb them in their entirety. This was the strongest ability of the tyrant body technique. It could absorb all energies, regardless of its type. It didn't follow the way of a benevolent king who would accept any and all. Rather, it was a tyrant who knew only domination. Yi Shiwen had just finished absorbing that energy, but he saw a startling and black divine beam just then. And it had already arrived in front of him. The space in front had collapsed and had been broken into small pieces. He was still fearless. The long sword danced in his hand as he swept out a world-shaking aura. Yi Shiwen had used the buried heaven sword, and that too for the first time. Nobody among his peers had been able to compel him to use the buried heaven sword. The use of this attack against the experts of older generation would have been pointless, since they possess far more tyrannical strength than Yi Shiwen. The incomparably aggressive sword power swept down. It shattered the space, and the chaos leaked out. It seemed as if this sword would bury the heavens, restart the age of chaos, and open the pathway for a brand new world. The buried heaven sword displayed infinite power in Yi Zaiwen's hands. Yi Zaiwen's offensive had grown much more potent than before. His attack, and that long lance collided ferociously. They came in contact, but soon moved away. Then the lances and the sword's tip rushed towards their respective targets. However, the spot where the collision had taken place collapsed and broke down into pieces. A huge force swept across the surroundings, and even the void caved in. Everyone was dumbstruck by this spectacle. This fight had reached a mind-boggling level. Bang! A giant explosion took place. A figure went flying upside down. Blood dripped from his body and spilled in the sky. Everyone looked closely. It turned out to be Yi Shiwen. The second god's strength had increased significantly after he had revealed his real Titan body. The evenly matched fight had suddenly transformed, and Yi Shiwen had fallen into disadvantageous situation. The second god pursued after Yi Shiwen with strides as mighty as that of a tiger or a dragon. His lance swept down straight towards Yi Shiwen. It rampaged forward like a long dragon. It seemed as if it would destroy the entire world. Bang! Yi Shiwen firmly blocked the second god's attack. Yi Shiwen, you are done for. Obediently accept your death. The second god's countenance turned sinister as he spoke. The thought that he would kill Yi Shiwen had made him happy. Everyone's hearts began to beat ferociously. Could it be that Yi Shiwen would be killed? Yi Shiwen had fallen into disadvantageous position. He had merely relied on his excellent recovering ability to gain advantage over his opponent. But that advantage had disappeared after the emergence of the second god's real Titan body. The onlookers couldn't help but sigh with emotion. The special physiques had been famous in the entire world for countless years, and it wasn't without reason. They always possessed a concealed advantage that an ordinary person couldn't match. They could easily achieve the level of proficiency an ordinary person couldn't in their entire lifetime. Not to mention that the prestige of Titan bloodline had suppressed the entire world for countless years. However, Yi Shiwen clearly didn't have such an advantage. This was his biggest disadvantage in this fight. Therefore, he had fallen into disadvantageous position. Countless people were worried for Yi Shiwen. Yet he was very calm for some reason. His expression didn't change one bit. The look in his eyes got more and more profound on the contrary. In fact, there wasn't a single trace of anxiety in his heart. These special physiques were outstanding. The second god had changed entirely after his Buddhist transformation. He had been beaten and suppressed by Yi Shiwen in the beginning. However, he had started to suppress Yi Shiwen now. This massive transformation couldn't be described in words. However, Yi Shiwen didn't lose heart. He had willingly chosen this path. He was on an expedition to fight and kill his way to the top. He had been in such thrilling fights several times. He had gotten so used to it that his heart was as honed as a solid rock. Most importantly, Yi Shiwen had understood that it must have been extremely difficult to exhibit the real Titan body. It was similar to any other secret technique, and would eventually get used up. After all, the second god merely possessed the Titan's blood. He wasn't a real Titan. Therefore, this transformation would end once his real Titan body got exhausted. However, this battle would still be a difficult one even if Yi Shiwen clearly understood this fact. The second god's moves had caused serious injuries to him after the transformation had taken place. After all, there was a big difference between their levels. Yi Shiwen would still have been able to suppress him by merely raising his hand if they were at the same level, same realm. Despite the body transformation, an average person might not have been able to last this long if they were in Yi Shiwen's place, and were to unceasingly sustain such serious injuries. In fact, they would have perished in 5 moves or less. The terrifying power of the Titan blood had been exposed in its entirety. However, Yi Shiwen had the Phoenix regeneration technique. It had maintained him at his peak condition. The only way to kill Yi Shiwen was to kill him with a sudden explosion, since it wouldn't give him a chance to regenerate. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to kill Yi Shiwen. Time passed, second after second, minute after minute. Yi Shiwen sustained severe injuries again and again, but he managed to recover quickly each time. The second god had started to get anxious. Just as Yi Shiwen had speculated, it was impossible for him to maintain this real Titan body for long. After all, he wasn't a real Titan. Things would turn out very badly for him if he couldn't kill Yi Shiwen before he exhausted his advanced form. Roar! The second god roared. The lance swept out and penetrated the blue sky. The world suddenly lost its color, and the sky turned pitch black. Bang! Yi Zaiwen's long sword welcomed the incoming attack, but couldn't block it. He was again sent flying upside down. He spouted blood, and the bones throughout his body got shattered. The second god was about to proceed to kill Yi Shiwen. But suddenly, the earth and the sky began to shake frantically. The sky disintegrated, and 2 suffocating dreadful auras swept down from above. A person's figure came flying down, and spouted a mouthful of blood. Everyone exclaimed because they had seen that person before. It turned out to be Bai Jiansong. He had sustained severe injuries all over his body. Another figure came chasing after. It was the senior elder of the Clear Sky Peak. Both of them had sustained serious injuries. However, his condition was much better than that of Bai Jiansong. However, he appeared to be in a distressed situation as well. His complexion was pale. He was at the peak level of the Great Sage realm. Yet he had been reduced to such a distressed state by Bai Jiansong, a man who had stepped into the initial stage of the Great Sage realm only recently. Chapter 400. There must have been a difference of heaven and earth between the initial stage of the Great Sage realm and the Great Sage complete realm. However, he had still been put into such a distressed situation by Bai Jiansong. He had lost face because of this, so he felt humiliated. His complexion had also turned exceptionally unsightly. However, he couldn't give much thought to this right now. He coldly looked at Bai Jiansong and said, "The higher authorities have agreed for this fight. It doesn't matter whether your hidden star peak agrees or not." His voice thundered like the sound of a big bell. It shook many of the spectating experts. They staggered a little since they couldn't stand steadily. This was a terrifying senior expert of the Great Sage realm. Even a breath of his could blow them away and kill a group of people in one fell swoop. The eyes of the Clear Sky Peak's senior elder turned ice cold as he looked at Yi Shiwen. His gaze was exceptionally cold. He originally wouldn't have gone as far as to personally get involved in this mess. However, nobody could harmonize this conflict between the second god and Yi Shiwen. These 2 individuals weren't fighting to attain hegemony in the younger generation. Rather, they were mortal enemies. One of them would inevitably have to die. So the Clear Sky Peak could only support its own disciple under these circumstances. The Clear Sky Peak had paid an incredible price in order to get the high-level experts' approval that had allowed them to show their support towards the second god. The second god possessed the blood of the Titan race. He would have incredible future prospects. In fact, he had even been assigned the position of the chief disciple. They had high hopes from the second god. It was a known fact that the true martial university recruited disciples once in 100 years. Moreover, there was no lack of Heaven's Pride level experts among these new disciples. And the Clear Sky Peak was ranked among the top 10 inheritances. Many Heaven's Pride level experts would often choose to join one of these top inheritances. The Clear Sky Peak had only seen 3 Heaven's Pride level experts join their ranks in this millennium, and all of them had already entered the Sage Realm at the time of their joining. However, they had finally selected the second god, and had assigned him the position of the chief. One could imagine his value in their eyes. However, the second god had this kind of a mortal enemy, so it was worth it to spend some more to help him get rid of this enemy. It was better than offending some old and stubborn high-level expert. Not many people would be offended anyway. However, every member of Hidden Star Peak wanted to settle this dispute for Yi Zaiwen's sake. However, he wouldn't let anybody interfere in this battle. In fact, he himself wouldn't intervene. One mustn't disturb this fight between the disciples regardless of its outcome. Moreover, he didn't need to interfere because the second god had already obtained the victor's position. Bullshit. I don't care what your higher-ups have agreed to. Damn it all. You've dared to aim for a person of our Hidden Star Peaks, and it is only to break our backbone. You did that so our peak isn't able to make it through this hard time. Bai Jiansong roared. Blood spilled out from the corner of his mouth. The people of Hidden Star Peak had never bothered to hide their shortcomings from the others. The senior elder of the Clear Sky pair didn't care about Bai Jiansong's clamoring. He took it as a funny joke. The Hidden Star Peak was undoubtedly a latent power. However, Clear Sky Peak wasn't a simple power either. And it certainly wasn't like the War Dead Star Peak, whose chief had been chased around like a dog by Huang Wuji. Clear Sky Peak was one of the top 10 inheritances, and the War Dead Star Peak hadn't even entered among the top 100 inheritances. There was an unimaginable difference between the two forces. The Hidden Star Peak had maintained a low profile, so much so that many people were unaware of the Hidden Star Peak's true power. Everyone drew out their conclusion on the basis of the battle that had just taken place. How strong was Bai Jiansong? He had stepped into the Great Sage Real at such a young age. He would have boundless prospects in the future. However, he still wasn't an opponent for a senior elder of the Clear Sky Peak. His cultivation was too short and lacking in comparison. Perhaps, this weakness wouldn't have been this obvious if he had fought against an opponent from the younger generation. However, it had gotten exposed in its entirety, while facing a tyrannical expert of the older generation. Presumptuous, the Clear Sky Peak senior elder coldly scolded. Who are you to raise your voice against a high-level decision? Damn it. You old bastard. You will pay if something happens to my sixth brother. Bai Jiansong exclaimed. Meanwhile, it seemed as if Yi Shiwen and the second god hadn't even noticed these two terrifying experts. They just continued to fight. It should be mentioned that the second god had become relaxed after he saw that the elder of the Clear Sky Peak had gained an upper hand. In fact, he had become even more impatient to kill Yi Shiwen. And Yi Shiwen had started to resist the second god's attacks even more wholeheartedly. The two of them were too busy to worry about others. They continued to fight. The second god launched an attack. It seemed as if the world itself had lost its color, as if the sky would come crashing down to the ground. The vigorous power of the lance exploded, and rushed straight towards Yi Shiwen to kill him. The second god hadn't used any unnecessary skills. He had merely used pure energy in this attack. Yi Zaiwen's long sword danced in his hand. The sword intention overflowed in the surroundings. Yi Zaiwen's previous attacks had certainly been repelled. However, Yi Zaiwen's fighting intention hadn't declined one bit. His attack rushed into the sky. The point of the lance emitted a white beam in reply. The battle had turned exceptionally intense. Blood was unceasingly gushing out of Yi Zaiwen's body, but his wounds had instantly repaired once again. But some wounds had gradually started to appear on the second god's body. The wounds weren't very deep. However, it was still bad when one considers that he was in his transformed form. Many onlookers exclaimed, Several of them were very impressed to see that Yi Shiwen could actually injure the real Titan body. He had only done minor damage, but it was enough to prove their speculation that Yi Shiwen would go for a major counterattack once the second god's real Titan body subsided. Bang! Both of them ferociously collided once again. Then they were sent flying in the sky by the collision, though Yi Shiwen went much farther. Both of them spouted blood. Both of them had arrived in a neither side wins situation once again. Their bodies were covered in all kinds of wounds, and blood continued to ooze out from these wounds. Yi Shiwen had sustained more severe injuries than the second god. However, Yi Zaiwen's wounds got restored in a flash once again. This Yi Shiwen is holding his own in this battle against the real body of a Titan. This is unbelievable. An average person's bones would have shattered into pieces if they had received one such blow, and the next blow would have crushed them to death. Perhaps this situation is unfavorable for the Titan guy. As you can see, Yi Shiwen has slowly started to gain the power to fight back. Perhaps this isn't very good news for that Titan guy. Yi Shiwen may make a sudden comeback as long as he doesn't kill Yi Shiwen in one blow. Yi Zaiwen's recovery may not continue like this for long in my opinion. However, it's also possible that the Titan guy won't be able to keep his real Titan form for long. This Titan guy has always done things his own way. He's arrogant and despotic. He doesn't pay attention to anyone. There are rumors that the Clear Sky Peak has paid a considerable price because the Titan guy stood up and took the oath that he'll forever and ever guard the Clear Sky Peak. That's how he has obtained the Clear Sky Peak's support. Well, anyone would agree to the fact that it's extremely tough to get rid of Yi Shiwen. Die! The second god roared. His entire body got covered with cyan-colored energy waves as he swept forward. The entire world trembled. It seemed as if an ancient Titan god had been resurrected. He went all out in an effort to kill Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen didn't hold back either. His body was his best defense. So he continued to fight. This was a battle of life or death, an incredible mortal combat. Both the individuals had gone all out. So even a small negligence could cost them their life. Both the individuals had put their lives on stake. Other people felt their hair stand on end. This mortal combat had left them in utter shock. Especially Yi Shiwen, since he had managed to keep up with the Titan guy till now. After all, his cultivation level was far inferior to the second god's. The second god growled. Yi Shiwen had been gradually returning to the earlier situation, where he had the upper hand. The second god knew that Yi Shiwen hadn't become stronger. Rather, he himself had become weaker. The suddenly outburst of power that was required for kickstarting and maintaining the transformation had left him weaker than before. Therefore, his transformation had started to fade. His eyes flashed as he stimulated his blood to unleash all sorts of Titan arts, and all of them were aimed at Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen merely brandished his sword to tackle to the incoming attacks. No matter what kind of Titan powers you throw at me, my one sword move can destroy 10,000 principles. Yi Zaiwen's long sword vigorously began to gather energy, and suddenly launched an enormous attack. Both of these individuals were walking on the same route, the so-called route to the Great Tao, and they must arrive there easily. The easier it will be, the closer one would get to the Great Tao, and the more terrifying one would become. These two had mutually chosen the easier path of attempting to kill one another. Therefore, only one would come out victorious. This path was easier, that's all. From the second god slowly occupying an absolute upper hand, to Yi Shiwen regaining his position in the battle. This battle had reached its most tragic phase. Both of these individuals had caused severe wounds on the body of the opposite party, and these wounds were difficult to heal. The blood was gushing out of those wounds. They had thoroughly beaten each other's bodies. Their bodies were completely covered in blood as a result. Rumble! They collided again, and a figure went flying upside down. Everyone looked closely. It was the second god. On watching carefully, one could see that the second god's real Titan body had disappeared. There was no difference between him and an average person at this moment. Blood was dripping from his body. He had fallen into the disadvantageous position in this clash of absolute power. Yi Zaiwen's sword slashed several times. Each of his slashes cut through the Tao principles of the world. It seemed as if the era of primal chaos had been restarted. The sword slashes rushed towards the second god. One by one, it seemed as if they were pursuing his soul. This was Yi Zaiwen's turn to counterattack. It seemed as if the heaven and the earth, the sun and the moon, had started to revolve around Yi Zaiwen's long sword. Those who wouldn't obey would be cut apart. Yi Shiwen pushed the second god into the disadvantageous position. Everyone was dumbstruck by this. Many people had already guessed this move, but they were still extremely shocked to witness it happen in reality. Pucci! Yi Zaiwen's long sword emitted an incredible divine beam. It chopped off second god's left arm. This fight had entered the deciding stage of life or death very quickly. The second god screamed. His entire body was covered with bloodstains. Even his courage had been cut off by Yi Shiwen. Some bitter resentment was left in his eyes, but he no longer had that same imposing aura he previously did. He still possessed the invincible strength, but no longer had the invincible heart. Everyone had gone silent. Nobody had thought that this could be the outcome. There would have been no problems if the second god had been merely killed. However, he had been first brought to the point of being terrified before getting killed. He would now be scared until he had died. After all, he had even used his biggest hidden trump card. Still, he had miserably failed to beat Yi Shiwen. How could he not be terrified after that? I'm invincible. You're merely relying on your secret technique, and nothing more. Otherwise, I would have killed you effortlessly. The second god said, and it seemed like he hadn't yet resigned. Humph. I'm relying on secret technique? You have a titan body. Isn't that unfair? You would have been nothing more than a pig in my eyes if you didn't have that titan body. You're very stupid. Yi Shiwen coldly retorted. Chapter 401. Yi Shiwen wasn't angered by the second god's remark. Rather, he found it laughable. The second god was too naive in making such a ridiculous claim that Yi Shiwen had relied on a secret technique. He himself had relied on his titan body to spread his tyranny. However, he hadn't thought that he wouldn't have been ranked as a Heaven's Pride level expert if he didn't have the titan body. He had consistently flown with the wind, and had ended up becoming accustomed to it. It was normal if he won. However, if someone else won, it meant that they had drawn support from some secret technique. According to him, his titan body must be treated as an ordinary fighting power, while the other secret techniques were external powers. This was a very immature and laughable way of thinking. The second god had never come across any setbacks or defeat in the past. And Yi Shiwen had emerged from the bottom, and had made his way to the top by killing everyone who stood in his way. There was nothing to compare between these two individuals. Yi Shiwen had never thought about how outstanding his innate talent was, or how noble his bloodline was. He merely wanted to get stronger than the others, and he had struggled for the same purpose. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that every single step that he had taken had left bloody footprints behind. A short-time defeat couldn't sway his firm mindset. So what if the opponent was stronger than him? It didn't matter whether his opponent was using his own strength, or some external help. He would do anything in his power to kill his enemy. He would hone his own strength and get stronger if he didn't have enough strength. He would strive to surpass his opponent, no matter what. And then he would defeat them. This was precisely because he had never placed himself above everyone else. He knew that there must be others who were probably stronger than him. He also didn't consider his innate talent to be at the peak. Therefore, a temporary setback was unlikely to sway his confidence. However, the second god was different. He had always had a smooth sailing. His titan body had given him invincible confidence. Even the other Heaven's Pride level experts were afraid of the consequences. However, he had never thought of the possibility of losing. Today, his biggest moral support had been smashed by Yi Shiwen. One could only imagine the kind of mental state he was in. Humph. Am relying on secret technique? You have a titan body. Isn't that unfair? You would have been nothing more than a pig in my eyes if you didn't have that titan body. You're very stupid. Yi Shiwen coldly retorted. Bang. Yi Shiwen slapped the second god, and he went flying in the sky. He spouted blood from his mouth. His robust body had gone flying upside down. Fortunately, The Titan body was incomparably strong. This slap would have smashed another person's body into pieces. However, even then his flesh had cracked open. His red blood, which was mixed with cyan-colored divine blood, gushed out like a shower. Everyone was dumbstruck. A pin-drop silence spread. Everyone was in utter shock after they witnessed this. This scene was extremely horrifying. Those who saw this scene were extremely terrified. They had speculated how this mortal combat would turn out to be, and how one person would win the battle by a narrow margin. However, it turned out to be very different from what they had anticipated. There had always been a big gap between the two fighters. The Titan guy had initially suppressed Yi Shiwen with the help of his Titan body, and then, Yi Shiwen had fought back and suppressed him. Then again he had unleashed the real Titan body, and had suppressed Yi Shiwen completely. Thereafter, Yi Shiwen made a comeback in the end. However, he had now come across Yi Zaiwen's cruel suppression. The Titan guy had gained fame several years ago. He had enjoyed the reputation of a top-notch expert of the younger generation in his early days on this ancient road. In fact, he had attracted the attention of the experts of the true martial university before he had even stepped on this ancient road. He hadn't joined the true martial university willingly, as if to boast his own importance. Rather, he had stepped on this ancient road. Even so, he had managed to gain an outstanding reputation. He had caught the attention of several experts of the true martial university from that time itself. However, nobody knew where Yi Shiwen was at that time. Yi Shiwen used to be one of the outstanding new talents who had risen abruptly at that time. But he was far from being comparable to the second god. They didn't belong to the same level. However, nobody had thought that the second god would be suppressed by Yi Shiwen. They had never anticipated that a man who had already stepped into the semi-sage realm would suppress by one who hadn't even entered the semi-sage realm. This outcome would have been normal if they were at the same realm. After all, even a small disparity between the contending experts could create a huge difference in the fight's outcome. Therefore, determining the winner in a single move wasn't something strange either. However, it turned out that Yi Shiwen hadn't even entered the half-step Legendary's great complete realm, let alone the semi-sage realm. Even so, he had completely suppressed the second god. The second god had been beaten miserably. In fact, he was nearly half dead. One of his arms had been cut off, and he had been sent flying into the sky by a slap. Impossible. I'm invincible. You're nothing compared to me. The second god roared. His black hair swirled in the wind. His mind was in chaos. He believed that he was invincible. However, the facts showed otherwise. He had suffered defeat at the hands of Yi Shiwen. Moreover, it wasn't an ordinary defeat, but a crushing one. He had basically been suppressed by Yi Shiwen very thoroughly. So, how could he possibly be invincible after that? How did this happen? The second god appeared like a madman at this moment. He shot a punch across the sky. The endless thunder and lightning mixed with a cyan-colored storm, and rushed towards Yi Shiwen. He straightaway abandoned the lance, and used the remarkable Titan powers. Titan race had once shaken the entire world, and the heavenly clans with their inherent powers. The second god's move exploded the world, and it seemed as if the world had lost its color. An ancient aura swept out. It seemed as if this aura had crossed the river of time to arrive from the past. Yi Shiwen exposed a cold smile. His golden divinities started to surge and boil. He used the move Hidden Dragon Rises from the Abyss. His hands transformed into a pair of dragon claws, and welcomed the incoming attack. Rumble! The second god was struck by Yi Shiwen again, and was sent flying into the sky. His arm was shattered by the terrifying power. This was the first time he had fallen behind in a clash of pure strength. His arm had been crushed by Yi Shiwen. This outcome would have been unimaginable during the early phase of their battle. However, it seemed pretty normal at this time. Nobody felt anything wrong with it. Everyone knew that Yi Shiwen had gained an upper hand. The second god had been trapped in confusion. It wasn't like he didn't have the power to fight on equal terms. However, he was no longer Yi Zaiwen's opponent now. That was because Yi Shiwen had seized his willpower, and had eliminated his fighting intention. It's impossible. Blood was unceasingly gushing out from the corners of the second god's mouth. It was very hard to believe. What Titan body? Your ancestors were titans, but do you know how formidable they were in reality? Those formidable and glorious titans disappeared long ago. Moreover, you only possess titan's blood. Nothing more. Yet you proudly rely on your titan power? In fact, you dare to boast about it? Don't you think it's rather laughable? Only an invincible heart can lead you on the road to invincibility. Anything else is insufficient to depend on. Yi Shiwen spoke. Do you think that I'm fortunate to have this secret technique that has made me victorious? I've arrived here by walking step by step. I didn't have a smooth sail like you did. I had to kill many powerful enemies. In fact, I barely managed to save my life many times. Only then have I managed to create this disparity in our strengths. It's not by a fluke. It's not luck. The second god's eyes turned somewhat dull after he had listened to Yi Zaiwen's words. His vision wasn't conceited as before. It seemed as if he had realized that his perception wasn't the reality. He had finally come out of his illusion. He unceasingly groaned in a low voice. He had never imagined that he could lose in this manner. Actually, not lose but outdone. He had always underestimated the bloodline of ordinary people. Yet his noble bloodline lost today, and so had his pride. He had been certain of his victory in his heart, because he possessed the Titan bloodline. However, his bloodline had lost, and so his ego had disappeared. I had forgotten about your army of God, and what had happened between us. I didn't expect that you would come forth so impatiently. You've courted your death by doing so. Nobody can save you now. Yi Zaiwen's countenance turned grim as he spoke. Yi Shiwen didn't wish to show any mercy. He and the second god had tried to kill each other countless times during the course of the battle. Only the death of one of these two could end this battle. Therefore, he was unlikely to show any mercy. Clang! Yi Zaiwen's long sword soared in the sky. It streaked across the vast sky in a split second, and rushed towards the second god to split him apart. Is this the end? Will it end like this? This mortal combat will end with the defeat and death of the second god? Bang! A terrifying collision sound resounded. Yi Zaiwen's long sword had crashed into a big hand. That big hand was made up of energy, and it had grabbed Yi Zaiwen's long sword. Yi Zaiwen's complexion suddenly changed. Someone had dared to interfere in this battle of life or death. He looked upward. It was the senior elder of the Clear Sky Peak. Old man, what is the meaning of this? Yi Shiwen asked in a cold voice. There was no trace of respect in his words. This old man had left a very bad impression on him from the beginning. He had dared to provoke the hidden star peak without any hesitation in order to support the second god. He had also injured the third brother. The elder merely turned towards the second god and shouted, "You idiot! You should be happy that this only the outcome of a battle, nothing more. It's nothing. You have long way ahead. Your road is still quite long. Sage Realm? Even the great Sage Realm won't be the peak of your achievements. A temporary setback like this one is nothing. You will get the opportunity to bathe in the snow sooner or later. You can clear your reputation then." The second god's eyes gradually began to regain their vigor after he heard the senior elder's shout. He realized that this was merely a fight, nothing more. It was no big deal. He still had a future ahead of him. He could always get a chance to bathe in the snow and wash away his shame. He had always been an outstanding and shrewd talent. He had been terrified by Yi Shiwen for a short period of time. But the great confusion in his heart had vanished within a moment. His defeated state of mind had also vanished. In fact, it had regained its previous form by now. The elder seemed satisfied as he watched the second gods recover. He nodded with satisfaction. He had some regrets that Yi Shiwen wasn't dead. However, it didn't mean that the second god hadn't harvested anything from this battle. He was sure that Yi Shiwen wouldn't be able to escape next time. Yi Shiwen felt very regretful as he watched the second god regain his state of mind. He had scared the second god and seized his willpower with great difficulty. But the second god turned out to be fortunate since someone interfered. Yi Shiwen recalled this old man had previously said that the higher authorities had agreed to this mortal combat, and that no one was allowed to interfere. Yet he himself had interfered. This was pure shamelessness. What was more annoying was the fact that the elder was still instigating the second god to cause trouble for Yi Shiwen in the future. You have no sense of shame, you old guy. Yi Shiwen clenched his teeth tightly as he stated. Give it a rest. The battle has ended. It's hereby terminated. The senior elder flatly stated as if he was merely notifying everyone about the matter. Chapter 402. Didn't your elders teach you how to respect an elder? Anyone can commit mistakes. One must forgive them when possible. That elder from the clear sky peak spoke with a strong sense of righteousness. He didn't seem to feel any shame in his heart. Yi Shiwen was like an ant in his eyes. Yi Shiwen might have boundless future prospects. However, that was a matter for the future. He didn't care about it. He had the backing of the clear sky peak, and it was one of the top 10 inheritances. Yi Shiwen wouldn't be a big threat for a top 10 inheritance, even if he were to grow stronger in the future. Even if he were to become a top-notch senior great sage expert. This was one of the main reasons why this elder had allowed the second god to kill Yi Shiwen despite the protests from the hidden star peak. People don't care about an ant's feelings. They merely trample ants to death. Yi Shiwen must shed tears of thankfulness for not being stamped to death. That was the elder's way of thinking. Yi Shiwen clenched his teeth and spoke. Respect an elder? It depends on whether you deserve it or not. Do you even behave like an elder? Moreover, you said that anyone can make mistakes. So one must forgive them when possible. But he came here to kill me. How can you possibly call it a forgivable mistake? Anyone can commit mistakes. One must forgive them when possible. This was a great sounding and pompous saying, but it had vanished long ago. This was a typical case of using double standards, one set of rules for other people, and a completely different set of rules when it comes to oneself. You're just a corrupt old fogey who likes to cheat by using double standards. Yi Shiwen sneered and retorted impolitely. Do you wish to die? It's true that you're a peerless genius who has boundless future prospects. However, you're not even a semi-sage expert at present. The senior elder of the clear sky peak threatened him. His complexion turned somewhat unsightly. Yi Shiwen was like an ant in his eyes. And he had dared to say such insulting words to him. This was an enormous provocation. It's genuinely laughable. Others mustn't interfere since the higher authorities have given their consent to this fight. These were your words. However, the man who shamelessly intervened at the end was you. Is your clear sky peak filled with people like you? Yi Shiwen sneered and retorted. The killing intention flourished in Yi Ziwen's heart. This senior elder of the clear sky peak had a bias in the second god's favor. This inspired his killing intention, and the anger flourished multiplicatively. This was very pathetic. Firstly, they advocated this fight to death, and now they were against it. Everyone stared blankly at Yi Shiwen. He had held an extremely stubborn image in everyone's eyes since the beginning. He had even killed the law enforcement hall's disciples after having announced it beforehand. However, they hadn't anticipated him to be this arrogant. He was looking down on a senior elder of the great sage realm. He had even talked back maliciously, and had insulted the senior elder in the process. This elder of the great sage realm wasn't a generous person by nature. However, Yi Shiwen had still dared to be so courageous before him. This inspired a sense of reverence in people's hearts for Yi Shiwen. Well said. Clear sky peak is like this only. Bai Jiansong sneered as he came over to Yi Ziwen's side. He seemed in a somewhat distressed state. However, nothing could conceal his rebellious nature. I'll stop this old guy. You go and kill that guy. I'll see who dares to stop you. Damn it. Didn't he say that the higher authorizes have given their consent? Bai Jiansong sneered. The anger in his eyes could burn the blue dome of sky. He certainly knew the intention of that clear sky peak senior elder. The higher authorities had agreed to Yi Ziwen's slaughter by the second god's hands. And it was also clear who had made them do so. However, they couldn't say it openly. So it seemed like they had only agreed for the two individuals to settle their personal grudges. However, they hadn't anticipated that Yi Shiwen would gain an upper hand in this battle instead of the second god. Bai Jiansong was suddenly aggrieved in his mind. He didn't know what price the people of the clear sky peak had paid. However, this matter hadn't ended yet. It seemed like the people who had approved this matter had only included one individual in their calculation, not the other. Bai Jiansong, is this what you teach your new disciples? The Titan body is a genius of our true martial university. He can become the backbone of our university in the future. Do you understand? The senior elder of the Clear Sky Peak looked coldly at Bai Jiansong as he spoke. Well, that very individual lost in the battle. Yet, you still dare to boast about him? Haha. I'm really out of words here if you're saying that this so-called genius of your Clear Sky Peak is proud that he can suppress an expert of lower realm. Bai Jiansong mocked in a satirical manner. Everyone secretly exclaimed in admiration. These two brothers were the same. Both of them were courageous, and had looked down on a so-called senior elder. Everyone understood Bai Jiansong's intention. The sarcastic meaning in Bai Jiansong's words was clear to everyone. He basically meant that the so-called geniuses of the Clear Sky Peak had no other talents apart from using their realm's advantage to suppress those at lower one. The senior elder of the Clear Sky Peak had used the advantage of his cultivation level to suppress Bai Jiansong. And the second god had also tried to do the same to suppress Yi Shiwen. Therefore, everyone believed that this was indeed true. Perhaps Yi Shiwen and his fellow brother apprentice would have chased down their opponents like stray dogs if they had been in the same realm. The senior elder's complexion had turned ashen. These two brothers had repeatedly mocked him. His complexion had turned exceptionally unsightly as a result of this. Humph. I see. You people of the Hidden Star Peak are courting death. The senior elder threatened. Yi Shiwen rushed ahead. The huge devil wings behind his body had opened up. Yi Shiwen had dashed towards the second god like the flash of a golden lightning. His devil wings were flapping at an incredibly fast speed. Moreover, Yi Shiwen had unleashed the entirety of his strength. He arrived in front of the second god in a split second. Audacious! The senior elder went completely mad. Yi Shiwen had dared to make a move in his presence. This clearly demonstrated that Yi Shiwen had looked down on him. This suddenly sparked immense anger inside him. The senior elder of the Clear Sky Peak launched an attack almost instantly, and a shocking divine beam was sent rumbling towards Yi Shiwen. Yi Ziwen's devil wings flapped behind him, and he dodged that sharp divine beam. Bang! The divine beam ripped open the space and the chaos leaked out. Everyone was terrified by this scene. Old man, you're truly shameless. Bai Jiansong released an astonishing sword beam. You can't recognize what's good for you. The senior elder snorted coldly. He grabbed that sword beam which could have easily cracked open the sky. And then he crushed it. Afterward, he advanced towards Yi Shiwen to kill him. Ha! A delicate yet loud shout came from the horizon. The clouds began to tremble frantically. A magnificent attack streaked across the vast sky. It appeared like a giant black dragon as it swept down upon the senior elder. Bang! The senior elder couldn't evade this attack. A whip struck him, and his body was nearly split apart. Bang! That old man went flying in the sky. The whip's attack didn't kill him. It just inflicted minor injuries to his body. However, his complexion had turned exceptionally ugly. He looked towards the origination point of that attack with a dull look on his face. A delicate and charming figure slowly appeared from the void. She looked approximately 20 years old. Her skin was glowing like snow. Her eyebrows were curved, and her mouth was small. She looked extremely beautiful. She was clad in a fiery red dress. She held a long whip in her hand. She looked valiant and formidable. Second sister. A smile appeared on Bai Jiansong's face as he saw this woman. He also felt a bit relaxed. Yi Shiwen turned around to see. He had heard a lot about the well-known second sister, but this was the first time he was seeing her. Lu Yanlan was famous for being a practice maniac. She basically practiced all year round. It was quite difficult to force her out of her practice. Crash bang! Another whip was swept down towards the senior elder of the Clear Sky Peak. It sent sonic booms in all directions. It appeared like black lightning as it quickly arrived in front of the senior elder. The senior elder had no other choice but to retreat frantically in order to avoid this whip attack. Everyone was stunned. Some people had recognized her. This was Hidden Star Peak's second disciple. She was named Lu Yanlan. However, She had merely used one whip attack to compel the senior elder to retreat. This kind of strength was too incredible. No wonder the hidden star peak was so strong. Huang Wuji was invincible. This second disciple Lu Yanlan wasn't easy to deal with either. Plus, Bai Jiansong had already stepped into the Great Sage Realm. And Yi Shiwen also had the potential to enter the Great Sage Realm if he didn't perish in the way. The true strength of the hidden star peak had instilled a new level of reverence inside everyone's heart. The hidden star peak was small, yet proficient. It didn't have many people. However, they were elites, all of them. Lu Yanlan merely stood at her spot. Her aura was as tyrannical as an endless ocean. Her energy could swallow thousands of miles. She appeared like a goddess. Her temperament was ice-cold and unapproachable. Yi Shiwen shot a glance at her and rushed towards the second god to kill him. He didn't even stop once. The second god saw Yi Shiwen approach him. He was startled, but he became furious as well. He hadn't anticipated that Yi Shiwen would dare to launch an attack on him despite the opposition from the Clear Sky Peak's senior elder. Moreover, Yi Shiwen looked desperate to kill him and wasn't willing to let him off. Suddenly, his heart began to burn with anger. He had never realized that Yi Shiwen would have tried to kill him even if he hadn't insisted on a fight with Yi Shiwen. However, the upper echelons of the university would be alerted if Yi Shiwen were to kill him now. This obviously left Yi Shiwen to feel more threatened by the second god's existence. Things might become very messy in the future if Yi Shiwen were to spare the second god. You wouldn't dare! The second god roared loudly. Stop! The Clear Sky Peak's elder shouted. He wanted to help the second god. However, Lu Yanlan and Bai Jiansong couldn't possibly have allowed him succeed in his plan. They joined forces and launched attacks on him. Bang! The fight between those three great sage experts caused the collapse of the sky. The earth trembled, and the chaos leaked out from the spatial debris. The space got crushed wherever they trod. This great sage-level battle was exceptionally frightening for most spectators. Yi Shiwen had rushed towards the second god to kill him without showing any regard for the senior elder's opposition. The second god had recovered a lot since he had taken advantage of the time. However, his healing speed couldn't be compared with Yi Ziwen's. After all, Yi Shiwen had the Phoenix regeneration technique, while he didn't. Time had passed quickly, and he had only managed to recover to some extent. However, he didn't have the means to continue to withstand Yi Ziwen's attacks. Bang! He wasn't Yi Ziwen's opponent. Yi Ziwen's slap sent him flying into the sky. I'm invincible. The second god shouted in a somewhat demented manner. Yi Shiwen sneered. Yi Shiwen trod on a golden light and arrived in front of the second god. Then he launched a grindstone-like slap at him. Stop! The Clear Sky Peak's elder roared. However, Yi Shiwen paid no attention to it and slapped the second god a second time. Bang! The second god's body was disintegrated by Yi Ziwen's slap. Chapter 403. The Titan body was dead. The news exploded and spread throughout the True Martial University. It shook the entire True Martial University. This was the first time a Heaven's Pride level expert of the younger generation had died in a battle. However, this wasn't the thing that had shocked people the most. After all, the second god was the one who had issued the declaration for battle. Moreover, he had obtained the approval of the higher authorities. He had been able to issue a death match against Yi Shiwen as a result of this approval. Therefore, everyone knew that the battle between these two individuals wasn't going to end on a good note. In fact, one among them had to die. However, they had never thought that the person to die at the end would be the second god. Everyone had thought that it would be Yi Shiwen. After all, Yi Ziwen's strength was much lower than the second god's since they latter had already entered the semi-sage realm. One must know that their realms differed by heaven and earth since Yi Shiwen hadn't even entered the half-step Legendary's great complete realm. Everyone below the sage realm was like an ant. The semi-sage realm obviously wasn't the same as the sage realm. However, it still had the word sage attached to it. So it was bound to give immense strength. The legendary realm couldn't be compared with it. Therefore, everyone was optimistic that the second god would kill Yi Shiwen with ease. They had expected that he would thoroughly defeat Yi Shiwen at the very least. After all, Yi Zaiwen's realm differed by a significant margin. However, they hadn't anticipated that the person who would die in the end would turn out to be the second god. Moreover, Yi Shiwen hadn't used any cheap tricks to pull this off. He had depended on his tyrannical strength to suppress and then kill the second god. And that too after terrifying him. This had even scared the onlookers. They hadn't anticipated this outcome. The second god had nearly been driven to the point of insanity before death. Even the interference of a great sage expert hadn't been able to prevent his death. Yi Shiwen hadn't cared about facing the frightening coercion of a great sage expert. Word spread that Yi Shiwen had killed the second god. It caused a huge uproar. Countless people were discussing about this matter. They were discussing the possible consequences of this matter. The Clear Sky Peak was one of the top 10 inheritances. It certainly wouldn't shy away from expressing its wrath. The Hidden Star Peak wasn't a pushover either. It had already caused havoc throughout the war Dead Star Peak for Yi Shiwen. They weren't easy to deal with. That startling collision between the three great sage experts had transcended everyone's imagination. It had been a disastrous battle. A high-level expert was forced to arrive in order to prevent the two sides from killing each other. It didn't matter how the higher authorities would look into this matter, Yi Shiwen had suddenly become popular. Many people had started to remember him. People had initially believed that Yi Shiwen was at the bottom amongst the Heaven's Pride-level experts. However, it didn't look like that now. Yi Zaiwen's fighting strength was perhaps sufficient to rank him amongst the tops ones. He had become famous overnight. And that too in a world where many people were ambitious to compete on this road to invincibility. His peers felt a bit depressed. Yi Shiwen was powerful, and he wasn't even at the so-called 200th rank. Yet, he had established a scary reputation for himself. This frightened everyone even more. Everyone had seen that Yi Shiwen succeeded in defeating his opponent by depending on his true strength alone. However, such ability seemed exceptionally dreadful. The Clear Sky Peak had no choice but to suffer in silence. This was the first time they had been forced into such a situation. After all, they were the ones who had advocated this battle. They had paid a considerably high price in order to get the approval of the higher authorizes. However, what about the outcome? The second god had gotten killed by Yi Shiwen in the end. They had been taken aback by this result. Nobody had anticipated such an outcome. They needed to have a reason to make noise. The Clear Sky Peak had wanted to impose itself onto the Hidden Star Peak, but couldn't say something like let Yi Shiwen die to compensate second god's death. They couldn't say it out aloud even if they wanted this to happen. They had no option but to accept this outcome. Nobody would know if something were to happen in private. However, they would have to appear peaceful from the outside. At the very least, Yi Zaiwen's name had thoroughly spread in the true martial university. It was reported that even the supreme officials had heard this name. Killing the second god had also brought piles of trouble for him. For example, he had suddenly become famous. He had been named a Heaven's Pride-level expert before this battle. However, he hadn't been regarded on top thus far. That was because everyone considered him as the weakest amongst all the Heaven's Pride-level experts. However, this notion had suddenly changed. The Titan guy was considered at the top of Heaven's Pride-level experts. This was so because none of these Heaven's Pride-level experts had ever indulged in a mutual conflict. The battle between Yi Shiwen and the second god was the very first collision between two Heaven's Pride-level experts. Therefore, nobody could say who among these Heaven's Pride-level experts was stronger, and who was weaker. However, the existing fact was that Yi Shiwen had killed the second god. So, he had suddenly become the target of public attention. He had also obtained the top position among the Heaven's Pride-level experts on temporary basis. He used to have a low-key profile, and had stayed hidden on the side. However, he had suddenly become the center of everyone's attention at present. Of course, there were several disadvantages related to this. Yet it also had advantages. One of the advantages was that he had obtained the attention of higher authorities. Yi Shiwen had come to be known as a Heaven's Pride-level expert in the past. However, very few people regarded him as a genuine one. He hadn't been acknowledged by the higher authorities. After all, Yi Zaiwen's cultivation had been lower than the minimum requirement of half-step Legendary's Great Complete Realm at the time. So, it was quite difficult to tell whether he had boundless future prospects or not. After all, he didn't seem much different from most of the ordinary people. The true martial university had been standing tall and upright in the southern region since countless years. They had even ruled the entire true martial world once upon a time. So they wouldn't look at the short-lived fads. Rather, their gaze was fixed at the matters of the future, several hundred, or even several thousand years from now. Therefore, it was quite difficult for a short-lived tyranny to attract their attention. Only the people who had at least practiced till half-step legendary 9th stage could obtain their acknowledgement. And even so, the experts of half-step legendary 9th stage were merely considered elites. Only the experts of half-step legendary's Great Complete Realm could be called as real heaven's pride-level experts. One's present tyranny didn't ensure that they would remain as such in the future. They must be able to become the true martial university's backbone in the future, after 1,000 or several thousand years. This incident of agreeing to this death match had been largely related to this notion. Yi Shiwen hadn't made them feel that he was unexpendable. However, the situation had reversed after this incident. Yi Shiwen had obtained everyone's acknowledgement in its entirety. Therefore, the true martial university rewarded Yi Shiwen with a 100,000 primary spirit dawn after he had killed the second god. They gave him other rare herbs etc. as well. Yi Shiwen felt that he had genuinely obtained the true martial university's attention, not just materialistic rewards. Bai Jiansong had mentioned that this matter had alarmed one very senior person. This senior person had opened his mouth and spoken, "You've made enough noise. Now go back and reflect on your mistakes in seclusion." The Clear Sky Peak had initially wanted to cause trouble. However, they had no other choice but to abandon their idea of causing trouble after looking at the power and influence of this senior person. The Clear Sky Peak certainly had the wrong stance in this matter. But that senior person seemed in a mood to punish the innocent and guilty alike. However, Yi Shiwen was rather pleased when he heard this news. This was indicative that the higher authorities wouldn't support the opposite party. Yi Shiwen had never hoped that the higher authorities would support him. However, this meant that they wouldn't cause any more trouble for him. This was the advantage of displaying strength. There were pros as well as cons to this. And to choose one of the two was beyond Yi Zaiwen's control. Yi Shiwen was grounded for a year as a punishment for killing the second god. The higher authorities had issued the punishment. However, everyone felt that this judgment was extremely biased in favor of Yi Shiwen. The price for murder was death penalty. However, Yi Shiwen was only grounded for a year. This indeed seemed like a biased decision in Yi Zaiwen's favor to outsiders. However, both the sides involved in this matter were very much dissatisfied. The Clear Sky Peak felt that this punishment was too light as per Yi Zaiwen's conduct. However, the Hidden Star Peak felt otherwise. Yi Shiwen had killed the second god. But their side hadn't instigated this matter. Everyone had agreed upon this death match. In fact, many high-level officials had even witnessed the battle. Killing one's opponent in a death match shouldn't lead to a punishment of being grounded for a year. This didn't make sense. Had this been done to bully the handful members of the Hidden Star Peak? However, Yi Shiwen himself didn't complain. He could tell that the higher authorities were divided into two factions over this matter. He could tell that both the factions had arrived at a mutual compromise to conclude this matter. He didn't see any loss in this matter. There was no harm for him in being grounded for a year. In fact, he could seize this opportunity to consolidate this half-step legendary 9th stage realm. One could only imagine how difficult it would have been to condense principles in this realm. Yi Shiwen must spend time to consolidate these newly acquired things. And this was the best chance. The only problem was that he had planned to go to the chaotic heavenly territory. This trip could only be put down for now. Time passed quickly. It didn't stop for anyone. It passed day by day. The effects of the sensation caused by Yi Shiwen also faded away with time. Several people would arrive every day at the Hidden Star Peak after Yi Shiwen had been grounded for a year. They'd hoped to see Yi Shiwen, who was undergoing closed-door training at the steep cliff of the Hidden Star Peak. They would often come to take a look at this temporary top heavens pride level expert of the younger generation. However, this sensation slowly quieted down like any other matter along with the passage of time. Day by day, month by month, it had slowly disappeared from people's discussions too. No new news disseminated during the 1 year's time that Yi Shiwen spent grounded. It was indeed a short-lived fad. So people forgot this person named Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen was happy being idle since he could practice properly. He could comprehend the Tao principles without being disturbed by the others. There is a gap of one entire realm between Yi Shiwen and second god. Realm versus stage. Think of realm as an accomplishment in martial arts. But there are usually several stages that one must cross in order to attain one accomplishment. And one attains new powers and expertise with each new accomplishment. Sometimes these changes are qualitative. For example, if a semi-sage expert releases a certain amount of energy, it should be able to beat the same amount of energy released by an expert of lower realm. That's because the semi-sage level energy is qualitatively superior. The same can be said about one's physical strength. However, not many changes on the qualitative side occur with each new stage. Only quantitative changes occur. Chapter 404. 1 year passed. The hidden star peak was still the same as it was 1 year ago. It was still tall and lofty. It still seemed as if it would pierce the sky. It had been nearly restored to normal appearance post the destruction caused by the startling battle that had taken place over a year ago. It had been the same since hundreds of thousands of years, somewhat desolate but with a boundless presence. Ma Wenrui was an ordinary former disciple of the Heavenly Ocean Peak. This peak was situated in the vicinity of the Hidden Star Peak. He would pass through the Hidden Star Peak every day. He had done so for over 100 years. He had entered the true martial university over 100 years ago. He had traveled like this every day ever since because he wasn't an elite disciple. So he wasn't qualified enough to reside on the Heavenly Ocean Peak. Therefore, he had to travel to the Heavenly Ocean Peak to attend lectures every day. Afterwards, he would return to the city. He passed through the Hidden Star Peak today as well, just like every other day. It was nothing special. He had been doing this for more than 100 years. However, the peak had turned a bit livelier over the last 2 years. The disciples of this peak had obtained a whole new level of respect in the eyes of the people. Huang Wuji, Yi Shiwen, Lu Yanlan, and Bai Jiansong were once unknown names. But the reputation of these individuals had slowly spread in these few years. Their reputation might have brought more trouble to their doorstep. However, provoking them wasn't a good thing. The law enforcement hall had provoked them once. Several of their disciples had been slaughtered as a result. And one Heaven's Pride level disciple had also died doing the same. This was disastrous loss. The War Dead Star Peak had also dared to provoke them once. Consequently, their chief had been chased around like a stray god. Even the Clear Sky Peak had provoked them once. And they were amongst the top 10 inheritances. Their Heaven's Pride level expert had been killed in the end. Even the senior elder of the Clear Sky Peak had been put into a distress situation by the joint attacks of Bai Jiansong and Lu Yanlan. So they weren't able to get any benefit in the end either. In fact, they had paid a huge price in order to get the approval of the high-level experts. However, their future chief had ended up getting killed in the end. Yet they hadn't been able to obtain anything. This series of incidents had made the Hidden Star Peak famous. Many ordinary disciples had gotten unusually envious of them. The Hidden Star Peak was like a huge hornet nest. Poke any one of them, and that might provoke a bunch of people. Something like this naturally wasn't possible in other inheritances. Other inheritances had more than hundreds of thousands of disciples. So, only the super elites enjoyed such privileged treatment. Otherwise, those elders and superiors would have to deal with such matters all day long. Suddenly, Ma Wenrui felt an enormous pressure rise upon his heart. One could clearly see that countless black clouds had assembled in the sky. And they were moving in the Hidden Star Peak's direction. An exceptional heavenly tribulation hovered over the Hidden Star Peak. This attracted the attention of many people. The true martial university was certain very large. However, It wasn't a big thing for these people with supernatural powers. Any activity in any area could easily attract the attention of several people. Not to mention that this strange event was happening at the Hidden Star Peak. A majority of people had gradually forgotten the Hidden Star Peak after the big event that had taken place a year ago. However, several resolute and interested individuals hadn't forgotten about it. Ma Wenrui was panic-stricken since he realized that this heavenly tribulation was far beyond his imagination. It wasn't an ordinary tribulation that merely rained down thunder and lightning at its target. Rather, this one comprised of a group of lightning soldiers. All of them were clad in metal armors and held long spears in their hands. They were vigorously rushing towards the Hidden Star Peak to kill their target at this moment. This scene nearly scared him to death. He had seen such heterogeneous heavenly tribulations, but only in ancient books. However, he hadn't seen such a frightening heterogeneous heavenly tribulation in real life. Those soldiers possessed the strength of semi-sage realm. They possessed extremely tyrannical strength. Their bodies were condensed of lightning Tao principles, and magical symbols were floating around them. This spectacle would frighten anyone. The entire Hidden Star Peak had turned into a huge battlefield. Hundreds of lightning soldiers swept down like a rain of lightning and launched attacks. Each one of these attacks was an exceptionally horrifying martial art. A figure was marching back and forth among these lightning soldiers. His hands were like claws, and these claws were emitting golden light of Tao. Each time he attacked with his golden claws, a lightning soldier would get ripped apart. It would then transform into energy and would get absorbed by him. Yi Zaiwen's complexion was the same as usual. Even this many lightning soldiers couldn't make him anxious. This heavenly tribulation was more terrifying than the previous ones. This was comprised of an army of lightning soldiers. These were more dreadful than those lightning apes or the lightning demon beasts and so on. It was as if the heavens will itself had taken form and had crusaded against this evildoer since he had surpassed the tolerance and patience of the heavens. Bang! Yi Zaiwen's palm pierced through a lightning soldier. The tyrant body technique was operating throughout his body. That lightning soldier got absorbed by Yi Shiwen, and the transformed lightning went inside Yi Zaiwen's universe. A tremendous change was occurring inside Yi Zaiwen's universe, since he was absorbing endless amount of such formidable energy. The quantity of cosmic dust increased more and more. His universe had started to appear more and more like the real one. A new planet began to form inside the solar system by attracting and accumulating countless dusts. The planet finally took shape and began to revolve on its orbit around the sun. Each of these lightning soldiers was a terrifying expert of the initial stage of the semi-sage realm. An expert of the semi-sage realm would be an awful opponent for any other individual. However, they were unworthy in front of Yi Shiwen. It wasn't that these lightning soldiers were weak or anything. Rather, Yi Shiwen was too powerful. He had used this over a year's time to practice. The number of principles within his body had also reached the upper limit of his capacity. He had condensed 299 principles. Of course, the number of new Tao principles that he had condensed in this duration wasn't much. However, these newly condensed principles were 10 times more powerful than the ones he had condensed in the past. That was because the degree of condensation was very solid and deep. This had increased Yi Zaiwen's strength tremendously. In fact, his one causal punch could blast away a dozen experts of the initial stage of semi-sage realm at once. Yi Shiwen wasn't even afraid of the experts of the intermediate stage of the semi-sage realm. Moreover, he would be able to condense 200 more Tao principles after he had crossed the heavenly tribulation. Then, he'd be able to beat an ordinary expert of the intermediate stage of the semi-sage realm. Bang! 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 Those lightning soldiers would collaborate from time to time. But, they still couldn't sway Yi Shiwen. In fact, he didn't even need to defend himself. He merely used his palm to grab and explode these lightning soldiers. Yi Shiwen had genuinely started to feel the benefits of laying a solid foundation. His foundation was very profound, and his strength was very tyrannical. As a result, he was crossing this tribulation quite easily. He might have succeeded in crossing this tribulation a year ago with the help of his strength. However, he wouldn't have crossed it this easily. Each of these lightning soldiers was only marginally weaker than the last year's Yi Shiwen. Therefore, their sheer number might have succeeded in defeating Yi Shiwen a year ago. However, Yi Shiwen could easily wrap them up at present. This was the advantage of laying a robust foundation and a profound martial power. Yi Shiwen was unaware that several people had gathered to see him cross the tribulation. They were nearly scared to death as they witnessed this. Each of those lightning soldiers appeared like a god to them. Each one of them had iron armors and long spears. It seemed as if these soldiers were on an expedition. However, they couldn't even withstand a few moves that Yi Shiwen casted. They were getting annihilated left and right. They were no match for him. The manner in which Yi Shiwen went about on a killing spree inside that group of lightning soldiers made it seem as if a god had descended into the mortal world. This left countless people to evaluate Yi Shiwen at an even higher level. In fact, nobody said anything regarding Yi Ziwen's title of a Heaven's Pride level expert from the moment he began to cross this tribulation of the Great Complete Realm. Some people had questioned his title in the past. They had said that he hadn't yet reached the half-step Legendary's Great Complete Realm. However, nobody would say that now. This heavenly tribulation was extremely scary. But it was evident that crossing it wouldn't be difficult for Yi Shiwen judging by the power he was displaying. This also meant that Yi Shiwen would become even more terrifying after he had entered the half-step Legendary's Great Complete Realm. Bang! 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 These lightning soldiers were ferocious and unafraid of death. They rushed forward one by one. Each of them displayed exquisite martial arts. However, they were too weak to compete against Yi Shiwen. They were slaughtered, one after the other. The heavenly tribulation ended. The planet Uranus had been fully condensed inside Yi Ziwen's universe. The solar system had improved by one step. Bang! Yi Ziwen's aura became uncontrollable, and it surged towards the sky. He had finally entered the half-step Legendary's Great Complete Realm. Yi Ziwen's aura got thicker, fuller and richer. It could be said that the earlier Yi Shiwen was like an unsheathed sword sharp. But he was now like a sword that was inside the sheath. Not shining, but far more frightening. Yi Ziwen's legendary level power had grown even richer after he entered the half-step Legendary's Great Complete Realm. It had reached the level of perfection. That's why it was exhibiting such a rich feeling. Yi Shiwen felt a familiar yet strange energy flowing inside his body. It was different from what it had been in the past. It had previously seemed as if a huge barrier was blocking his way. However, this barrier had suddenly vanished. It seemed as if an unseen force had been firmly stopping him from having a breakthrough and condensing 300 Tao principles in his body. But this unseen power had suddenly vanished. Yi Shiwen promptly sat cross-legged. He began to absorb the power of the surrounding principles and started to condense them into Tao principles in the form of magical symbols inside his body. The Tao principles appeared like magical symbols as they began to spin inside his body. They gradually condensed and emitted a mysterious aura. 299, 300, 350, 400. The count of Tao principles inside Yi Ziwen's body reached 400, and he started to feel that the accommodation of principles within his body had temporarily reached a saturation point. He would need to temper and refine his body further in order to go past the mark of 500 Tao principles. This amount was required to enter the later half of the semi-sage realm. However, Yi Ziwen's fighting strength was already sufficient to compete with the top experts of the intermediate stage of the semi-sage realm. Yi Shiwen heaved a sigh of relief. He had finally entered the half-step Legendary's Great Complete Realm. His foundation had become very robust. This showed that he didn't possess less potential than those other Heaven's Pride level experts. Yi Shiwen was extremely happy about this. The heavenly tribulation had just ended. A pretty figure appeared treading on the rainbow light and arrived on the hidden star peak. Chapter 405. Yi Shiwen has successfully crossed the Great Complete Level's tribulation. His foundation must reach perfection. His power must soar up high. Yes, reaching half-step Legendary's Great Complete Realm is like turning into a dragon from a fish. He's no longer an ordinary person. It's not surprising that Yi Shiwen managed to kill that Titan guy. He has crossed an extremely terrifying heavenly tribulation. An average person would have met with an untimely death. However, Yi Shiwen treated it like it was nothing. Was that heavenly phoenix body who just passed by? Yes, that's her. I've seen her only once from afar at that. But why has she arrived at the hidden star peak? Several people were discussing about today's tribulation. Yi Shiwen had once again gained importance in everyone's eyes. Sister Hua. Yi Shiwen was surprised for a moment. He didn't expect that the person to arrive would be Hua Menghan. However, he saw a woman clad in black dress. She looked approximately 17 to 18 years old. Her eyebrows were black and curved. She had a tiny mouth and bright eyes. Her fluid glance moved like ripples. Her skin was as white as snow and had a jade-like texture. It was as if a fairy had descended on earth. Her beauty seemed pure and untainted. Wasn't this really Hua Menghan? Yi Shiwen saw her treading on the rainbow light. She arrived in front of him in an instant, like a streak of electric flash. He was greatly surprised by this. Hua Menghan had restrained her aura. But the principles were faintly fluctuating in her aura. She had reached the peak of the intermediate stage of the semi-sage realm. She was surprisingly a bit faster than him in terms of cultivation. Long time no see, Sister Hua. You're still as elegant as before. Your cultivation is somewhat ahead of mine. Yi Shiwen couldn't help but sigh with emotion. Hua Menghan's progress had been incredibly fast. He had heard the discussions of the surrounding disciples. He hadn't anticipated that Hua Menghan would turn out to be that heavenly phoenix body. Yi Shiwen had recently established his power and glory, but the other heaven's pride-level experts had carried their own titles for a long time. In fact, people seemed to have forgotten their real names as the time had passed. Yi Shiwen had heard the name Heavenly Phoenix Body many times. However, he had never thought that it would be referring to Hua Menghan. However, it wasn't a big deal even if she had the Heavenly Phoenix Body. These Heaven's Pride-level experts had magnificent innate talent. In addition, many of them had special physiques. Moreover, their respective inheritances put their entire energy and resources to groom them. They could obtain the guidance of their seniors in case of any difficulty. The Hidden Star Peak was in a bit of a difficult position in this regard. In fact, it was far worse than the other inheritances in this regard. The first disciple Huang Wuji was perennially absent from the peak. The second sister was always undergoing vigorous closed-door training. The third brother, by Jian Song, would also disappear occasionally. These three powerhouses were always a complete mess, and were mostly focused on closed-door training. That was because they had to rely on their innate talents because it was hard to have breakthroughs. The other two disciples, namely Yang Wenjun and Deng Shui Xian, were slightly lacking in the aptitude section. They had recently stepped into the later stage of the semi-sage realm, with the help of the complete version of the Hidden Star Scripture that Yi Shiwen had comprehended. The two of them had deep foundations as they had stepped into Legendary's great complete realm several decades ago. So they had suddenly obtained successive breakthroughs after they had comprehended the complete version of the Hidden Star Scripture. They had deep foundations. So, they should be able to step into the sage realm before they came to a halt. However, there was no way to consistently get directions from the inheritance or the seniors at this peak. Therefore, the practice conditions of this peak's disciples couldn't be compared with those of the privileged heavens pride-level experts at the other ones. In fact, an average person would have given up if they were in their place. Thanks to the mysterious space, Yi Shiwen could comprehend all the martial arts techniques. He didn't need the guidance of the teachers, and could well walk on his own. Otherwise, he would have fallen far behind based on the aptitude he had. However, this came with a heavy requirement for Spirit Dawn. Hua Menghan smiled faintly. Her fine black hair was covered with a shawl. She was as elegant as a fairy. Her demeanor had become deeper as her cultivation had become more profound. She was standing in front of him at this moment. However, she could fly up and get anywhere anytime. Where have you been all this time? I heard that you also killed that Titan body. It has caused a huge sensation in the true martial university. Hua Menghan spoke in her mellowed sweet voice. Yi Shiwen smiled bitterly. This matter had gained him a lot of fame. However, he hadn't intended it. He and the Titan guy had been mortal enemies from the beginning, so there was no way he would have held back. The two of them walked side by side on the lane of the hidden star peak. The setting sun was sketching a beautiful portrait in the background. Their shadows were long cast on a lane that no one had used in a long time, so it had turned somewhat desolate and bleak. Various kinds of herbs and fruits had overgrown at its edges, and the ones growing on the lane itself were gently brushing against their hands and leaving faint prints. "We are the people of Jianghu. We are bound to go through pain and suffering," Yi Shiwen replied with a smile. Hua Minghan chuckled and spoke. "Don't talk about pain and suffering. So many people in the true martial university are envious of you now." As if the bird has finally raised its head and revealed itself in the forest, Yi Shiwen indifferently said. Then he changed the topic. "However, one can only reach the top by overcoming the obstacles. I know this is your style." Hua Minghan looked at Yi Shiwen and spoke. "I knew long ago that your heart had big desires. Yuan School couldn't entrap you. And the true martial university won't be able to contain you either. Ha ha ha, you have more confidence in me than I do." Yi Shiwen laughed out loud. They were suddenly at a loss for words, and didn't know what to say. They remained silent for a moment, and walked ahead. A long while passed. Yi Shiwen opened his mouth and said, "There are many things in this world which don't happen according to one's wishes. And then we are left with no choices. I wish to walk on this road, and I wish to walk to the top. And one day the road will end. My fate is under my control, not the heavens. It's very important for you, isn't it?" Hua Minghan asked this question out of the blue. Yi Shiwen replied somewhat doubtfully. "You have always gone very fast. You never care about the scenery that you leave behind. You just keep going farther and farther away," Hua Minghan said. Yi Shiwen was somewhat speechless. Perhaps Hua Minghan was right. He had never harbored a sense of belonging to this world. He cared about his close relatives, but he had never cared about other stuff. In fact, he hardly cared about anything that was the reason why neither Yuan School nor the true martial university would be able to contain him. He genuinely possessed a heart with big desires. It seemed as if he just couldn't find any other thing to be worthy of his attention and care. Yi Shiwen looked at Hua Minghan. He didn't realize that the sun had already set. The moon had quietly climbed up the sky. The somewhat ice-cold moonlight had started to sprinkle on the earth. Hua Minghan looked extraordinarily delicate and beautiful under the moonlight. Her aura also appeared somewhat magical and fairy-like. It was difficult to put his heart's feeling in words. He didn't know what to say. It was a beautiful and charming scene, somewhat like the first time he had met her. "I didn't expect that the sister Hua would turn out to be Heavenly Phoenix body with the blood of the ancient Heavenly Phoenix." Yi Shiwen spoke. Yi Mo had told him that the Heavenly Phoenix possessed the noblest blood among all the phoenixes. They were the strongest among all the phoenixes, and were called the King of Phoenixes. Their status could be compared with the nine-clawed golden dragon of the dragon race. However, the Heavenly Phoenix race had disappeared without a trace long ago. Hua Minghan wanted to say this aloud but didn't. Rather, she muttered to herself, "I would rather not have this bloodline. It's too heavy a burden to shoulder. Too heavy." Then she abruptly smiled. Her bright smile blossomed like a spring flower. It was devastatingly beautiful. "I may never be able to catch up with you if I'm not quicker." Yi Shiwen gawked for a second. It seemed as if he was still trying to figure out what she meant by that. "Nothing. Forget what I just said." Hua Minghan spoke with a smile. "I have come here for a reason. Do you know about the chaotic heavenly territory?" Yi Shiwen became serious and replied, "Yes, I know. It's located in the foreign territory. There was a lot of chaos in the chaotic heavenly territory. The people of the true martial world weren't the only ones to visit it. It was home to many escaped criminals from the other regions. It wouldn't be wrong to say that it was very chaotic. In fact, many experts of the Great Sage Realm and above could be found in the depths of the chaotic heavenly territory. They were the self-proclaimed kings of their territories. But the areas closer to the true martial world were less dangerous since the experts found they weren't too powerful. After all, there were too many experts inside the true martial world. The great sage experts were also in abundance. So the unaffiliated experts and criminals of Great Sage Realm didn't dare to come in the vicinity of the true martial world. I have recently come out from my closed-door training. I'm planning to proceed towards the chaotic heavenly territory for practice. So, would you like to go together? Hua Minghan asked. The others have already entered the chaotic heavenly territory. Yi Shiwen knew that Hua Minghan meant the other heaven's pride-level experts. Well, why not? My punishment sentence will end in a few days. Then we can go together. Yi Shiwen had been planning to go to the chaotic heavenly territory. It was a coincidence that Hua Minghan also wanted to go. Now they could go together as companions. Several days passed in the blink of an eye. Yi Ziwen's punishment also ended. Nobody had put surveillance on him. However, Yi Shiwen didn't wish to challenge the dignity of the university either. The house arrest ended very quietly. Yi Shiwen had already flown away into the endless void along with Hua Minghan by the time some people remembered that it was time for his punishment to end. There was endless void outside the true martial world on the way to the chaotic heavenly territory. They had to fly past millions of feet thick atmosphere. They had to make their way through the thunder and lightning. There were different kinds of extremely frightening astral winds in the way as well. These winds could easily blast a truth-level expert to death. They could even blow away the experts of legendary realm and cause serious injuries to them. It was indeed a very dangerous place. However, both of them were top experts. Hua Minghan had reached the peak of the intermediate stage of the semi-sage realm, and Yi Ziwen's gilded tyrant form was very tyrannical. Hua Minghan was wrapped in a layer of silver-white flame. The astral winds that struck her body would get burnt into fragments by this flame. Yi Ziwen's gilded tyrant form was discharging golden rays of light. He merely allowed the astral winds to caress his body. He wouldn't get swayed at all. Even so, the two of them had to face difficulties as they moved ahead. They flew nonstop for 2 days and covered several hundred kilometers. The thick atmosphere of the true martial world is extremely terrifying. The Earth's atmosphere doesn't even come close. Yi Shiwen heaved a sigh and muttered to himself. They had faced many difficulties during their flight. The true martial world's atmosphere was much higher and thicker than that of the Earth's. It was extremely dangerous as well. Only sage experts could freely travel through it. It was very difficult for the semi-sage experts to pass through it. And the ordinary legendary experts would get blown away and sustain serious injuries. Yi Shiwen had arrived in the foreign territory once before, but he had used the transportation portal. Otherwise, it would have been impossible for him to pass through this atmosphere since he only had the strength of legendary realm back then. Chapter 406. One would see a grandiose sky if they'd look down from the endless void above. The sky appeared endless, and stretched as far as one's gaze could reach. This area was known as the chaotic heavenly territory. The chaotic heavenly territory was extremely big. It wasn't just some small territory. It was even bigger than the true martial world. It was easier to lose one's way in this boundless star ocean than in the sea. One must know that getting deviated from the intended direction in a huge sea might not turn out to be fatal. However, one might get separated from their destination by thousands of miles if one would deviate from their route in this endless void. Then they wouldn't be able to find their destination. Therefore, one must have the star map for directional guidance. Hua Minghan possessed one such star map. It wasn't difficult for an expert of her caliber to obtain one. Her current level wasn't very high. So, she could only access the layers of this territory that were in the vicinity of the true martial world, using the star map she possessed. However, it was possible to use these star maps to access the depths as well. Therefore, these star maps were considered as treasures in the true martial world. These star maps were also considered as important strategic resources. Just like the other forces, the true martial university had also maintained fixed levels to access the depths of the chaotic heavenly territory for treasure hunting and so on. The possession of a more accurate star map would obviously ensure one's safety to a greater extent. The safety and security of the experts was very important. So different people could access different layers. This would be in accordance with their levels. The True Martial University had once ruled the entire true martial world. The True Martial University had sent out their entire manpower to explore the chaotic heavenly territory for resources at that time. Consequently, the True Martial University had obtained the most accurate star map. Many other forces had been eyeing this star map, and they had repeatedly tried to get their hands on one. However, the most accurate star map was in the hands of the supreme authority of the True Martial University. Other people only possessed the star maps of different precision and layers as per their ranks. However, even a primary level star map was enough for Yi Shiwen and Hua Menghan. They didn't intend to go into the depths of chaotic heavenly territory in any case. Venturing to the depths at their current levels was no different than throwing one's own life away. However, Yi Shiwen soon realized that this starry region was nothing like what he had imagined. It wasn't even remotely a silent and quiet place. On the contrary, one could get slaughtered at anywhere. Be careful. We would be going straight into a region controlled by star beasts, if this map is correct, Hua Menghan warned. A large number of star beasts were stationed in this starry void. These star beasts were extremely strange. They could somehow survive without air. Going into this region was extremely dangerous. Several star beasts emerged out of nowhere and surrounded them as soon as Hua Menghan's voice faded. These star beasts were even more tyrannical than the ones Yi Shiwen had encountered in the foreign battlefield. Each of these star beasts was pitch black. Their entire body was covered with scales. These fish-type star beasts had ominous fangs, and each of them looked extremely powerful. They nearly possessed the strength of legendary 8th or 9th stage. Their leader was at semi-sage realm. It was exceptionally powerful. Puff! 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 Each of these fanged star beasts spat water spears in unison. These attacks were centered at Yi Shiwen and Hua Menghan. Yi Shiwen didn't get enough time to attack, but Hua Menghan had already launched one. A flaming lotus appeared in her hand. It then expanded to face the attacks. Bang! A huge explosion occurred. The flaming lotus exploded among those strange fish-like star beasts. The terrifying temperature of the explosion destroyed those strange fish-like beasts. They couldn't even approach those two. The chief fish-like star beast was at the initial stage of the semi-sage realm. It was wounded by the flaming lotus explosion. So it roared as it opened its big mouth, and ferociously rushed towards Yi Shiwen to bite him. Its big mouth nipped at Yi Shiwen, and the void was broken into pieces. It was an extremely terrifying scene. Yi Shiwen dodged and rushed up. He sneered. His big hand stretched out towards that chief strange fish-like beast to grab it. This strange headfish was extremely tyrannical. So much so that it could bite an ordinary expert of initial stage of the semi-sage realm to death. However, how could Yi Shiwen be taken lightly? Even an expert of the intermediate stage of the semi-sage realm was no match for him. He could effortlessly grab this chief strange fish. It was a piece of cake for him. Roar! The chief fish was caught by Yi Shiwen. It roared, screamed, and struggled. However, Yi Ziwen's giant golden hand had firmly grabbed it. Bang! This huge strange fish was the size of a small mountain, but Yi Shiwen pinched to explosion. It got transformed into a mass of blood fog. Its flesh was absorbed by the heavenly source mirror, and its inner core was absorbed by Yi Shiwen. This replenished the solar system in his universe. His solar system hadn't been perfected yet. Yi Mo was absorbing the accumulated flesh and blood inside the heavenly source mirror. He sat cross-legged as he floated over the blood pond. He constantly extracted the energy from the star colossus, so that he could use it to strengthen himself and upgrade the heavenly source mirror. The heavenly source mirror's combat power was already knocking on the door of the sage realm. It would finally complete the first step of its restoration if it could cross this gateway. Moreover, Yi Mo would be able to condense his own body. He would finally be able to separate his soul from the mirror then. Therefore, Yi Mo was exceptionally careful in upgrading the heavenly source mirror. A majority of the primary spirit dawn they had received in the last 1 year had been absorbed by the heavenly source mirror. So it had made successive breakthroughs. However, it wasn't that simple to break through to the sage realm. The heavenly source mirror was better than the other divine tools, because it was a high-grade tool. It was only broken and incomplete at present, nothing more. However, it could enhance itself as long as there was sufficient energy. This was its biggest advantage. Other divine tools had to face one tribulation after another for each subsequent upgrade. In fact, they must suffer a lot before they could become a sage tool. The sage realm was a very large watershed for martial experts. And it was same for the divine tools. A tool would gradually begin to gain its own spirit once it had become a sage tool. Thereafter, its strength would increase very significantly. Some tools might even gain their own body like Yemo would. No matter whether it was an expert or a divine tool, they would become extraordinary once the sage word was attached to them. Yi Shiwen and Hua Minghan were extraordinary. Hua Minghan's flame had effortlessly grabbed the star beasts in that vast area, and had then burnt them to death in one fell swoop. Her attack could deal with a large numbers of enemies with ease. Yi Shiwen had no choice but to admit defeat in front of such an attack. He had no choice but to acknowledge that Hua Minghan was more powerful than him in this regard. The two of them joined forces, and continued to exterminate the beasts along their route. They had soon eradicated the star beasts of this area. However, this was just the beginning. The true martial university was in the vicinity. So those star beasts weren't considered very strong. They weren't like the Sage Realm and the Great Sage Realm star beasts that were present in the depths of this starry space. They proceeded towards a nearby assembly point. This place was known as the Wind Dragon City. They continued to eradicate the beasts that came in their way. There were many cities in this vast starry space. These cities were treated as nodal points in this mesh of stars. The Wind Dragon City was a nearby assembly point. It was a big city, and had a population of over 1 million. Many experts who traveled in the void would choose these cities to stop over for some time. The Wind Dragon City was regarded as a tyrannical place in the region. It had been reported that the city lord was a senior expert of Great Sage Complete Realm. He was alone a deterring force, and the experts of the nearby areas didn't dare to act presumptuous in front of him. This starry space was similar to the exile places on Earth. Many experts who could no longer stay in the true martial world had escaped into the void. So, the people who came here were often rebellious and unruly fellows. It was impossible to deter these guys without being tyrannical. This starry space might seem close to the true martial world. However, the distance between the chaotic heavenly territory and the true martial world was over 30,000 kilometers. How could it be easy to arrive there? A distance of 30,000 kilometers wouldn't have been a problem if the conditions on the way were normal and stable. However, the presence of star beasts and astral winds had made it a dangerous place. These beasts were always ready to incite trouble. These two had to move side by side, and were forced to exterminate the star beasts they met in order to advance. This would lend them great benefits in the future, because exterminating these star beasts was an important task. The true martial university and the other forces undertook this task very seriously. One must know that there was unending internal chaos among the forces of the true martial world. However, they would all unite when it came to dealing with foreign aggression. This foreign aggression was mostly headed by two groups. One was the Devil World. They would poke their nose into the true martial world's affairs from time to time. And the second was the Star Beasts. An enormous threat might be posed for the true martial world if a star colossus were to take birth among these star beasts present in the starry space. After all, what was the reason behind the true martial university's decline? They had opposed the invasion of a star colossus, and had thoroughly declined as a result. This had given an opportunity to the other forces to rise. Therefore, the true martial university and the other forces took it as an important duty to eradicate these star beasts from time to time. They had been collectively killing star beasts for many years. It wasn't easy for a powerful star beast to take birth among these small and weak star beasts. However, there was always such danger. Moreover, these star beasts reproduced very quickly, so it was required to wipe them out timely. Otherwise, they could pose a huge threat to the true martial world even without the leadership of a star colossus. Moreover, so many of these star beasts would make people's life difficult if they weren't exterminated from time to time. However, no one came to clean up the area frequently. Yi Shiwen and Hua Minghan advanced towards the Wind Dragon City, and continued to exterminate the star beasts throughout their route. Chapter 407. The two of them flew towards the Wind Dragon City, and continued to wipe out the star beasts that came in their way. They flew continuously for 10 days and 10 nights, and finally got close to the Wind Dragon City. They didn't take any rest during these 10 days and nights, and they continued to slaughter the star beasts. Yi Shiwen was unceasingly absorbing the star core either to transform his universe, or to strengthen his principles. He had undergone a number of upgrades in a short span of time. The principles he had recently condensed couldn't be compared with the ones he had done earlier. He had been using the star cores as nourishment. His growth speed had been nearly 10 times that of an average person thanks the non-stop and crazy struggle with these star beasts for 10 whole days. Hua Menghan's cultivation had also become more pure and proficient. She was just one step away from entering the later stage of the semi-sage realm. She was about to enter the later stage of the semi-sage realm. However, this wasn't the biggest surprise for Yi Shiwen. Rather, it was that the restoration process of Heavenly Source Mirror. It had reached the completion of the first step after it had absorbed the flesh and blood of countless star beasts. Yi Mo had dived deeper inside the mirror to complete the restoration. The Heavenly Source Mirror would perhaps be restored to the Sage Realm after the completion of this step. It would be able to provide a huge assistance to Yi Shiwen thereafter. Yi Shiwen would certainly be able to compete with the sage experts with this sage tool in his hands once he had entered the later stage of the semi-sage realm. He wouldn't fall into a disadvantageous situation. However, it must be assumed that his sage-level opponent wouldn't possess a sage tool of their own. Not all sage experts possess sage tools. Only the wealthy and outstanding sage experts kept sage tools. These two individuals had continuously flown for 10 days and 10 nights. They had flown at full strength, and had unceasingly exterminated the star beasts along the way. An average person would have already died if they were in their place. However, these two weren't ordinary people. The fast regeneration speed of Hua Menghan's Heavenly Phoenix Bodhi's magical power could frighten anyone. And Yi Ziwen's gilded tyrant form was extremely intrepid. He had only used his body to beat so many star beasts to death. He hadn't used his real elemental energy at all. Therefore, they didn't have to worry about anything, and forged their path with the blood of the star beasts. There were many other common threats present in this starry sky, such as meteorites, the space turbulence as well as the rogue chaos that floated in the space, the magnetic field storms, and so on. They hadn't experienced these things in the past. Both of them were Heaven's Pride level experts, but they still had to face great difficulties in dealing with these unusual situations. Yi Shiwen knew about some of these things from his previous life. However, he had never experienced them in person. He had never cared to find out more about them either. After all, he had never thought that he would be walking inside the void of the universe in person. Even a truth-level expert had the ability to survive in the space. However, the sheer amount of dangers present in the space was unimaginable. One would be lost forever if one didn't possess the strength of semi-sage realm. In fact, even the semi-sage experts only dared to travel on the edge of this space. They didn't dare to penetrate inside. The existence of a human expert was too tiny in this vast universe. Yi Shiwen, a turbulent group of meteorites is flying towards us. Hua Menghan gently alerted Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen raised his head to look forward. He saw several thousand meteorites in the distant space. They were rapidly approaching them. It seemed as if there was some kind of unseen attraction force in play that was attracting those meteorites towards them. It seemed like a long-range raid of the meteorites was approaching from very far away. Soon, this group of meteorites wasn't too far from them. These two couldn't hide or dodge even if they tried to. This universe might seem vacuum and empty at one glance. However, it was brimming with all kinds of magnetic fields. The power of these two individuals wasn't enough to send out their divine senses very far away from themselves. That was why they had discovered this group of meteorites only when it had come so close. This was also the reason why they were constantly bumping into star beasts, and were forced to slaughter their way out every time. This was all because the search range of their divine sense wasn't very long. Therefore, there was no way to avoid such meaningless fights. However, There were no formidable star beasts present here. Fortunately, these two would rarely come across the star beasts of the semi-sage realm. Moreover, Yi Shiwen could deal with two semi-sage beasts at once without breaking a sweat. Sister, you take a break first. Let me deal with it. Yi Shiwen laughed out loud and said, Okay. Hua Minghan smiled as she looked at Yi Shiwen. He was still beaming with energy and vigor, but she looked tired. Each of these experts possessed martial arts within their bodies to keep them energized. Capable experts like these two wouldn't be affected even if they didn't sleep for 1 or 10 years. Under normal circumstances. However, fighting continuously like this was a different thing. It must have exhausted their minds. Her heavenly phoenix bodice had indeed restored her real elemental energy, very quickly, and that would have saved her body from getting tired. However, the exhaustion of one's mind and spirit couldn't be avoided. However, Yi Shiwen was different. His gilded tyrant form was exceptionally tyrannical. He possessed incredible strength even when he didn't use his real elemental energy. Moreover, Yi Shiwen had often come across such long and excruciating battles in the past. His battles had often lasted for several days and several nights. He had experienced the most number of fights among all the Heaven's Pride level experts. He had never experienced the privileged and favorable practice conditions that were bestowed upon the other Heaven's Pride level experts. Rather, he had constantly struggled to slaughter his way up to this level. He was self-made, and had earned his success from the battles he had fought thus far. Fighting for several days and nights was normal for him. Clang! The sword intention appeared in Yi Zaiwen's hand and rumbled loudly. It suddenly expanded and transformed into a huge sword. He then brandished the sword towards those meteorites to chop them down at once. Bang! 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 The sword intention chopped up those meteorites into fine pieces. This task might have been very troublesome for an ordinary expert of the initial stage of the semi-sage realm. They could have been knocked down by this group of meteorites if caught off guard. However, it seemed like nothing to Yi Shiwen. Hua Minghan immediately followed after Yi Shiwen as he rushed through that group of meteorites. She said, You don't consider these meteorites anything, isn't it? She obviously wasn't afraid of these meteorites either. Her heavenly flame could burn these meteorites to ashes. Even Yi Shiwen had been flattered by her large-scale attack, since it could easily take on large groups. In fact, he had been stunned by her ability. However, Yi Shiwen had an upper hand when it came to the ease involved in his way to deal with groups. That was because he didn't need to consume too much real elemental energy, unlike her. Yi Shiwen laughed mischievously and spoke, Sister, you are flattering me. This is just a sword technique I've recently learnt. It's extremely sharp and swift. Buried person sword. Yi Shiwen shouted loudly. A sword intention appeared in his hand. It appeared like some form of a mystical entity. It then exploded into countless sword shadows. They overwhelmingly spread out towards the group of meteorites to chop them down. Bang, bang, bang. Those meteorites had been chopped and reduced to dust by that bright sword beam. The sight was similar to the most dazzling fireworks in the sky. Yi Shiwen had already practiced the buried sword secrets to the perfection level. He initially hadn't understood many of the concepts, but he had come to understand them now. The road to practice the swordsmanship to perfection was simply disastrous. Buried person, buried earth, buried heaven, and then the great nirvana at last. The great nirvana could break everything in existence and re-establish a very new great Tao. It had sounded awesome in Yimo's words. However, one couldn't always get the opportunity to practice it to the peak level. The existing world must be shattered and a new sword world must be re-established in order to practice it to the peak level. However, even the thought of that was impossible. The world would have been destroyed countless times in the last 8 billion years if it could be shattered so easily. However, the first 3 moves were still usable, and the buried sword secret was still considered as the supreme sword technique. It was the move that had been practiced by the expert who had fought head-on with the star colossus that could swallow planets and stars. It wouldn't have attracted the disciples of the true martial university if it wasn't good enough. Sister, what do you say? Do you like this technique? Yi Shiwen asked with a smile. It's quite fierce. It's difficult to learn and use this supreme technique of sword cultivation. Hua Minghan nodded and said. She felt that Yi Shiwen looked like a child who was happily flaunting his treasure before her. She couldn't help but laugh in her heart. However, she also had a nice fuzzy feeling, as if some ripples were bubbling in her heart. I can teach you if you wish to learn. Yi Shiwen offered with a smile. No, I don't need to have a sword cultivation technique. This sword power technique can be a bit beneficial. However, it's nothing in the long run. Hua Minghan shook her head and refused. After all, a majority of people had their own path they must follow. She knew that her road had been paved since the beginning of the awakening of the heavenly phoenix body. It was certainly a fabulous road. However, she didn't have many choices. Moreover, the recent awakening of her blood had presented her with many magical power techniques. They could scare a person to death if displayed. Her cultivation had reached such an extent in such a short span of time. The great contributions of those magical power techniques couldn't be ignored. On the contrary, Yi Shiwen hadn't chosen any path. He possessed a big heart and great ambitions. He wanted to walk on the road of martial arts. He wanted to use all sorts of martial techniques. Merely sticking to one road didn't suit him. Hua Minghan didn't wish to learn. So Yi Shiwen didn't insist. The understanding between the both of them had advanced by leaps and bounds after they had fought together for several days and nights. The mutual trust between them had also progressed greatly. Yi Shiwen wouldn't have said such a thing to her so abruptly in the past. However, it came out of his mouth quite naturally at this moment. Some unknown feelings had started to arouse between them. We must quickly rush to the Wind Dragon City and take proper rest. Hua Minghan's beautiful face revealed traces of exhaustion. Yeah, Yi Shiwen nodded. Their speed was extremely fast. They trod on the rainbow light and quickly moved in the empty space. They appeared like a streak of electric light. They had soon flown for another day and night. However, they had started to feel more and more heat for some reason. They looked in the star map and found a white dwarf in the vicinity. It used to be a star once. However, it had perished and transformed into a white dwarf. So, it was silently hanging nearby. Who are you? Suddenly, a loud shout sounded from afar. A group of warriors came flying out of nowhere. They blocked Yi Shiwen and Hua Minghan's path, and glared at them coldly. Chapter 408. Who are you? Suddenly, a loud shout sounded from afar. A group of warriors came out flying out of nowhere. They blocked Yi Shiwen and Hua Minghan's way, and coldly glared at them. Who are you two? How dare you come here? Don't you know that this is young Master Feng's restricted territory? One of those individuals flew out and shouted coldly. A bunch of tyrannical divine senses swept all over. Yi Shiwen and Hua Minghan immediately became anxious. Hundreds of tyrannical divine senses had performed soul searches across this area all at once. Most of these divine senses belonged to experts of the initial stage of the semi-sage realm. However, many among them also belonged to the ones at the intermediate stage of the semi-sage realm. There was no legendary expert among them. It was quite difficult for legendary experts to move freely in the void of the universe. They could at most travel between some assembly nodal points, that too under the leadership of semi-sage experts only. However, they would basically be a burden. But Yi Shiwen was completely different. He was even more ferocious than the experts of the intermediate stage of the semi-sage realm. Yi Shiwen and Hua Minghan hadn't anticipated that they would bump into a gang of experts and meddle with their business. At least hundreds of strong divine senses were floating in the vicinity, and each one was of the semi-sage level. There was surely a big conspiracy in place since so many semi-sage experts were gathered at one place, and these two had suddenly intruded into their territory. It was obviously impossible for the opposite party to maintain a good countenance. Excuse us. We had no intention to offend you. Yi Shiwen calmly spoke. We will leave immediately. Their priority was to rush to the Wind Dragon City. They would obviously prefer to have one less trouble on the way. You think you can come and go as you want. That's wishful thinking. It just so happens that this man's aptitude is better among these two. He's freely roaming in the space even though he has the trivial strength of the legendary realm. We can capture him and turn him into a slave. And that woman is extremely beautiful. We can capture her and offer her to young Master Feng as his 326th mistress. Haha. He will give us enormous rewards. I'm just afraid these two are probably the disciples of some big school. What are you afraid of? Isn't our young Master Feng using a matrix method to extract the core of that white dwarf? He's also looking for a way to devour the core. He can make a breakthrough into the Sage Realm after that. Then he will be able to oppress everyone in this vicinity with his tyranny. There's nothing to be afraid of. These people were discussing without any hesitation in front of Yi Shiwen and Hua Menghan. They obviously looked down on these two, perhaps because they considered these two individuals to be like the meat placed on a chopping block. It seemed as if they just needed to decide how to chop and when to chop. Yi Shiwen immediately raised his eyebrow. An angry look appeared on his face. He hadn't wished to get involved in this matter. However, it seemed like the other party had now given him enough reasons to get involved. Hua Menghan frowned. A disgusted look appeared on her face. The opposite party's obscene words had made her furious. She felt disgusted. "Brothers, attack!" one of the experts shouted. Several dozen experts of the initial stage of the semi-sage realm emerged from behind and surrounded Yi Shiwen and Hua Menghan. They were looking at the two of them with malicious intentions. They were drooling over the beautiful Hua Menghan in particular. It seems like we don't have any choice but to slaughter them. Yi Shiwen used his divine sense to communicate this to Hua Menghan. Hua Menghan nodded. Neither of them wanted to indulge in a fight with these people. They didn't want to fight an unnecessary battle. But these people didn't wish to let them go. "Attack!" Yi Shiwen shouted loudly. "Strike first and gain the upper hand, or suffer." Yi Shiwen knew this well. He shot Fire Cloud's falling sky hand. It appeared like a boundless burning cloud as it advanced towards those people to grab them. These semi-sage experts weren't some ordinary people. They responded almost immediately. "This man has dared to launch an attack on us. He's courting death. I've changed my mind. I don't wish to make him a slave anymore. I want him dead. Destroy his soul too, so that he can never reincarnate again." That semi-sage expert wasn't a good person. He had been enraged by Yi Shiwen, and so he ordered in an angry manner. The Fire Cloud's falling sky hand went across the vast space. It seemed as if its energy would swallow the entire world. The attack appeared majestic. It seemed as if a heavenly hand had swept down to burn down the whole world. Bang! 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 The attacks of those experts of semi-sage realm were instantly grabbed by the Fire Cloud's falling sky hand and were crushed into fine powder. However, the hand didn't stop here. The hand then rushed towards those semi-sage experts to grasp them. Bang! 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 Those semi-sage experts were grabbed by Yi Ziwen's Fire Cloud's falling sky hand. Then he crushed them. Those experts of the initial stage of semi-sage realm were turned into blood fog. They were no match for Yi Shiwen. They weren't even as good as those lightning soldiers. Not to mention, Yi Ziwen's strength had increased countless times after he had crossed that heavenly tribulation. Now he was far more tyrannical than he was before. Hua Menghan had also begun to attack. Her jade hands unleashed several secret seal techniques. The entire world suddenly began to heat up in an abnormal manner. The world began to burn as if it was set on fire. Everything in the radius of 5 kilometers had submerged in a burning sea of silver-white flames. This looked extremely scary. Those experts of the initial stage of semi-sage realm didn't get the time to escape. They were burned alive. They were reduced to ashes within seconds. Several experts of the intermediate stage of semi-sage realm couldn't take on these flames either. They met with the same fate. They possess far more tyrannical skills than those experts of the initial stage of semi-sage realm did. Therefore, they didn't burn to death in an instant like their weaker comrades had. However, it was even more horrible for them since they suffered extreme pain. First, their principles burned down, then their bodies, and finally their souls got exterminated. Their obscene words had thoroughly infuriated Hua Menghan, so she had started to use her most fierce attacks. She hadn't held anything back. These so-called subordinates of young Master Feng didn't know that they had messed with the wrong people this time. However, they quickly realized that these two weren't some random cultivators with no background. One was extremely fierce, while the other was very spicy. Stop. How dare you attack us? Do you know who we are? An incomparably terrified semi-sage expert spoke up. He was an expert of the intermediate stage of the semi-sage realm. He had just played the role of the leader a moment ago. However, he was no match for Yi Shiwen and Hua Menghan. These two individuals weren't ordinary people. The ordinary semi-sage realm experts were practically no match for them. Yi Shiwen sneered. The Han seal pounded down from above. This semi-sage realm expert was smashed and turned into blood fog. He couldn't even fight back. He would have never been able to stop Yi Zaiwen's attack. That was because even a causal fist attack of Yi Zaiwen's carried the power released by the combined attacks of dozens of experts of the intermediate stage of the semi-sage realm. Yi Shiwen slaughtered several experts of semi-sage realm in a matter of moments. They simply didn't stand a chance against these two. They were preparing to leave when suddenly a loud shout sounded. Who are you two? Do you wish to die? A big hand cut open the void and advanced towards Yi Shiwen and Hua Menghan to grab them. A terrifying power was boiling upon that hand. This power was invoking a grandiose pressure on those two. Yi Shiwen wasn't deterred one bit. He used his hands to counter. They got shrouded in endless golden light and ripped that big hand apart. Sister Hua, let's get out of here quickly, Yi Shiwen shouted. This big hand turned out to be of a peak expert of the later stage of semi-sage realm. Neither of these two could match him. Hua Menghan trod on the rainbow light without any hesitation and immediately flew away. Her speed wasn't slow, even when compared with the speed of Yi Zaiwen's devil wings. She possessed a top-tier agility technique. She had traveled 1,000 feet in the blink of an eye. Yi Zaiwen's speed wasn't slow either. He opened his devil wings and followed after Hua Menghan. Bang! That big hand grasped down as soon as Yi Shiwen left. The entire space was caught by that big hand. A large section of the surrounding space collapsed, and the chaos leaked out from the other side. Damn it! Don't you ever make young Master Feng see you again. Or else? The angry voice of a young man sounded from direction of the white dwarf. Yi Shiwen and Hua Menghan flew away for hundreds of miles. They came to a halt after they realized that nobody was pursuing them. Both of them were gasping for breath. They looked at each other and burst into laughter. They wouldn't pursue us till here. Hua Menghan said. Yes. Yi Shiwen nodded. They had flown hundreds of miles away from there, and the opposite party hadn't pursued them. There was obviously some reason that had kept them there. There must have been a reason why they hadn't chased after these two. Suddenly, Yi Shiwen recalled what one of those experts had said. It seemed like they were about to extract the core of the white dwarf. One could imagine how precious the core of a star could be. It was the essence of the entire star. The white dwarf was a dead star. However, its core was still a priceless treasure. However, the entire white dwarf could explode if one wasn't careful. The power of the explosion would be extremely terrifying. Everyone in the proximity of countless miles would be killed. Sister, you proceed to the Wind Dragon City. I will join you later, Yi Shiwen said. What are you going to do? Hua Menghan asked. I'm going to give them a pleasant surprise. Yi Shiwen laughed mischievously and stated. His eyes glittered like the tip of a sharp weapon. That's extremely dangerous. They have an expert of the later stage of the semi-sage realm. And it seems like there's more than one. You won't be able to deal with them alone. Hua Menghan spoke in a worried tone. Relax. There won't be a problem. They can't catch me with the kind of speed they possess. Yi Shiwen tried to console Hua Menghan. He wasn't consoling her with nonsense. One must know that an average person couldn't match the speed of Yi Zaiwen's devil wings. Moreover, Yi Shiwen had also perfected his tyrant body technique till the 6th layer. He wasn't an opponent for the opposite party. However, it would be impossible for them to kill him in an instant. And his Phoenix regeneration technique with its super-fast regeneration speed would quickly restore him back to normal, if they weren't able to kill him in an instant. In effect, he wasn't an opponent of the experts of the later stage of semi-sage realm, but they must also give up on the idea of taking him down. All right, I will also come with you, Hua Minghan stated. She was still worried for Yi Shiwen. Moreover, the vulgar words of those people had made her extremely angry. You don't need to come. It will be easier if I go alone. I know that I'm not capable of defeating them. However, they can't take me down either. I wish to give them a pleasant surprise this time. Yi Shiwen stated as he laughed. Chapter 409. Hua Minghan didn't insist after she listened to Yi Shiwen. She knew that Yi Shiwen would only say something like this when he was confident. Several people had said that Yi Shiwen was extremely arrogant and rampant. However, that was only true when he was attacked, and was compelled to counterattack. He wasn't stupid, and his thought process was also reasonable. Yi Shiwen hadn't entered the semi-sage realm yet. However, Hua Minghan knew that Yi Shiwen wasn't inferior to her. In addition, he was far more suitable than her for these circumstances. Yi Shiwen flew back without any hesitation after he had bid farewell to Hua Minghan. He had hidden his presence by operating the restraining breath technique. The golden divine beam on Yi Zaiwen's devil wings had been shrouded by thick black fog along with his entire body. Therefore, he could move ahead unseen. He was perfectly camouflaged in this pitch-black space. Yi Shiwen slowly approached that white dwarf. He saw that a massive matrix formation was covering that white dwarf. It looked extremely mysterious. Some incomprehensible energy was wandering inside it. For elderly experts of the later stage of the semi-sage realm were sitting cross-legged around that barrier. They were kneading with their finger to maintain a profound seal technique. A 20-year-old young man was sitting cross-legged over this formation. He looked quite handsome, yet strangely demonic. He was clad in a magnificent robe. The power inside the barrier was bubbling up towards him. His complexion was extremely ugly at this moment. An extremely evil look was present on his handsome face. Damn it. Don't let me catch you or I will crush your bones and burn you to ashes. The young man said with an evil expression on his handsome face. He was the one who had launched an attack on Yi Shiwen. However, Yi Shiwen had managed to escape. The tyrannical expression on his face had distorted his handsome look. He looked extremely frightening. I will find those two bastards after I'm done swallowing the inner core of the white dwarf and made my breakthrough into the sage realm. They must be killed because they've committed the crime of opposing our Feng clan. Young Master Feng roared like a lion whose tail had been stepped on. Young Master Feng, don't be impatient. I've already sent out a message out. I've asked our Feng clan's forces to look for the whereabouts of those two individuals. They can't run away. But they are probably the disciples of one of the forces of the true martial world. This matter can be troublesome later. One of those four old men opened his mouth and spoke. The true martial world. So what? It doesn't matter who they are, or where they've come from. Those who dare to provoke our Feng clan shall be punished. Young Master Feng roared. Fortunately, he was busy in maintaining the seal technique, and couldn't afford to cause any chaos right now. Young Master Feng will enter the sage realm once he swallows the inner core. Then he will become the main focus of our clan's resources and nurturing. He will be able to mobilize more experts of our clan. Then, we can even make the true martial world's heavens pride level experts disappear without any traces if they oppose us. Another old man spoke. Yi Shiwen pondered. He realized that this Feng clan was probably a huge force in the heavenly chaotic territory. Otherwise, they wouldn't have looked down on the forces of the true martial world. However, young Master Feng still wanted to wait until he had swallowed the inner core. Then, he would start to cause trouble for Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen sneered. How he could allow the opposite party to succeed. Yi Shiwen was hidden nearby, and wished to give them a big surprise. However, it might cause a huge problem for him if he allowed the opposite party to enter the sage realm. After all, a person would land himself in big trouble if a sage realm expert was dead set on causing trouble for the said person. Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen suddenly heard a shout. It came from the insides of his mind. This was Yi Mo's voice. Yi Shiwen was pleasantly surprised by this and said, "How did you wake up so soon? Weren't you upgrading yourself to a sage tool?" I've already completed the upgradation process. The Heavenly Source Mirror has become a sage tool now. Yi Emo laughed and said, "That's great." Yi Shiwen also laughed out loud and replied, "Several limitations that had previously existed have vanished since it has become a sage tool." Yi Emo spoke as he laughed. "We can now push the level of that blood slave to the later stage of the semi-sage realm. Then nobody will be able to match the blood slave, unless a sage expert appears." Yi Shiwen suddenly felt relaxed. He would have far more assurance if he had the assistance of a blood slave of the later stage of the semi-sage realm. He had previously planned that he would leave after he had stolen the white dwarf's inner core. But now he didn't wish to leave without dealing a serious blow to these experts. Yi Shiwen went inside the Heavenly Source Mirror after he had made the decision. The world inside the Heavenly Source Mirror had suddenly expanded by 10 times after it had become a sage tool. It appeared endless. In fact, it appeared like a small continent. It certainly wasn't the size of the world in itself. However, it was big enough for Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen arrived at the edge of the blood pond. That star colossus was still boiling inside the blood pond, but it had become very weak. The suppression force of the Heavenly Source Mirror had grown after it had become a sage tool. So, it didn't even have enough power to struggle. Its entire body was bound in a chain of magical symbols made up of principles. Its strength was being sucked away, little by little. It could only stare at Yi Shiwen with hatred, nothing more. It didn't even have the energy to roar. Yi Shiwen could now do many things since the Heavenly Source Mirror had become a sage tool. And the first thing he would do was to forcefully level up the blood slave. Yi Shiwen sat cross-legged over the blood pond. He stretched out his big hand and grabbed several principles. He condensed magical symbol out of the principles and instilled them inside the blood slave. The Tao principles flooded into the blood slave. Its aura started to become more powerful. It became more and more formidable with every passing moment. The primary spirit dawn were unceasingly burning inside the Heavenly Source Mirror. The transformed spirit energy was being instilled into the blood slave. 200, 300, 400, 500. The time passed in the outside world second by second, minute by minute. Almost a month had passed in the blink of an eye. The unceasing extraction of the white dwarf's inner core was still taking place. This was a very big task. Therefore, nobody was acting impatiently in this regard. Yi Shiwen was still lurking nearby. He was constantly condensing principles in order to instill them into the blood slave. The blood slave could even be promoted to the sage realm since the Heavenly Source Mirror had become a sage tool. However, Yi Shiwen didn't have enough energy to make that happen. Therefore, he could only condense approximately 800 Tao principles. There was no way to make the blood slave break through to the sage realm. However, it was temporarily good enough for the current Yi Shiwen. It was enough for him to give them a big surprise. Time passed slowly. Yi Shiwen felt that the white dwarf was getting hotter and hotter. It slowly began to disseminate enormous amounts of heat. Bang! A loud explosion occurred. Endless amount of lava began to erupt from that white dwarf. The lava soared into the space for tens of thousands of feet. Suddenly, Yi Shiwen had a cold feeling in his heart. He realized that these guys had genuinely managed to force out the inner core. Then, the inner core began to condense by absorbing the essence of the entire star. The terrifying force caused an endless amount of lava to erupt and disperse in the space. This was an extremely frightening scene. However, a cheerful look appeared on the faces of those experts of the Feng clan. Young Master Feng was also jubilant at the sight. After all, he had finally begun to see the result of his long-drawn efforts. He could rise to great heights once he swallowed the inner core and became a sage expert. He would obviously become very different from his present mere semi-sage expert then. There simply was no comparison between the two. His present status in the Feng clan couldn't be compared with the one he would relish at that time. This white dwarf had taken birth after its parent star had died. It was the same as the other things in this world. It also went from the time of its birth to that of its flourish, and then to its death. It couldn't escape from the laws of life and death even though it was a star. However, the lifespan of these stars was much greater than that of an average person's. They could easily last for billions of years. These stars were a source of light in the universe. This star had died and turned into a white dwarf, but it still contained incredible power. Young Master Feng had used a special method to condense that power into the extracted inner core. And the core contained enough energy to help him step into the sage realm in one fell swoop. One could only imagine the kind of energy contained in it. The white dwarf exploded. It suddenly emitted incredible light and heat. It seemed as if it had suddenly reached the peak of its prosperity once again. It illuminated all directions. One would only assume it to be daylight when they'd gaze at the sky from the true martial world. This special flash of starlight was precisely the dying flash of this star. The accumulated energy had burst out in a flash. And this was only the inner core of a dead star. It was simply impossible to imagine the amount of power the inner core of a mature star would possess, let alone the inner core of a massive world like the true martial world. The inner core of the white dwarf contained a massive amount of energy. However, the inner core was merely the size of a fist. A tiny inner core like this one possessed such enormous energy. Young Master Feng couldn't resist anymore. He rushed towards that tiny inner core of the white dwarf. He had wanted to obtain the inner core of this white dwarf since long. He had been waiting here for several years in order to find an opportunity to obtain it. This inner core had finally emerged. So it was finally the time to obtain it. An overjoyed expression appeared on his face. Yi Shiwen had remained hidden for quite a long time. However, he finally moved into action at this time. He stretched out his big golden palm towards that inner core to grab it. That you're tuning in to the Li Mei's Wuxia Whispers YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.